Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The first night in my new apartment, I woke at 3:17 a.m. with my heart pounding against my ribs. Something had pulled me from sleep. A sound so faint it might have been nothing more than the building settling. But I knew better. It was a knocking, deliberate and patient, coming from the hallway where that antique mirror hung. 3 soft taps, like knuckles testing the strength of glass. By the time I gathered enough courage to check, the hallway stood silent and empty, the mirror reflecting nothing but darkness. I should have taken it down that very night. The realtor had called the apartment a steal. Previous tenant left suddenly, she'd explained, voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Family emergency out of state. Left most of the furniture behind rather than pay for storage. Her smile had been practiced, professional. Just sign here, initial there. Congratulations on your new home. I'd been desperate after the divorce. Anything to escape the suffocating emptiness of the house where Lisa and I had once planned a future. The apartment felt like a fresh start. Compact but tastefully furnished with a mix of mid-century pieces and a few older items that gave the place character. The carved wooden mirror in the hallway caught my attention immediately. It hung between the living room and bedroom, impossible to avoid when moving through the apartment. 7 feet tall with an ornate frame of dark wood, it dominated the narrow space. The glass itself seemed unusually deep, as if the reflection extended farther than it should. When I asked the realtor about it, she'd shrugged. Came with the place. Previous tenant insisted we leave it exactly where it is. Something about the feng shui being perfect. Her laugh had sounded nervous. I should have recognized the warning signs. After that first night, I convinced myself the knocking had been my imagination, a dream, the pipes, or simply the normal sounds of an unfamiliar place. For the first week, everything seemed normal. I unpacked my meager possessions, arranged my home office, and tried to establish new routines. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, something changed in the apartment's atmosphere. The air grew heavier, particularly in the hallway. Walking past the mirror required a subtle but unmistakable effort, like pushing through invisible cobwebs. The temperature fluctuated inexplicably. Sometimes I'd wake drenched in sweat despite the thermostat reading 65 degrees. Other times I'd find myself shivering under 3 blankets. 2 weeks after moving in, I first noticed the shadow. I was returning from the kitchen with a cup of coffee when movement in the mirror caught my peripheral vision. Not my own reflection, but something else. A dark shape that seemed to drift across the glass a half second after I passed. By the time I turned to look directly, nothing was there except my own pale face staring back. I told myself it was a trick of the light, an optical illusion caused by the apartment's unusual angles. But deep down, a primal part of my brain began to recognize the truth. Something was wrong with that mirror. The incidents escalated gradually. The knocking returned, no longer confined to the dead of night. Sometimes I'd hear it while making dinner or working at my computer, 3 distinct taps followed by silence. When I mentioned it to my neighbor across the hall, he looked puzzled. Said he never heard anything like that, but this building was old, full of quirks. He asked how I was sleeping, if I was taking anything for anxiety. His concern made me doubt myself. Sleep became elusive. I'd lie awake listening for sounds from the hallway, my body tense with anticipation. When exhaustion finally pulled me under, my dreams were filled with suffocating darkness and reflective surfaces that showed things that shouldn't be there. I began researching the building's history. The apartment complex had been converted from a hotel built in the 1920s. Nothing particularly sinister appeared in my searches. No mass murders or tragic suicides that might explain a haunting. I couldn't find information about previous tenants either. Nothing to indicate why someone would abandon their furniture and flee. One night, after 3 glasses of whiskey to quiet my nerves, I examined the mirror more closely. The frame was hand-carved oak, darkened with age, featuring intricate patterns of intertwined vines and what might have been faces peering out from between the leaves. The craftsmanship suggested European origin, perhaps late 19th century. The glass itself seemed unusually thick, with a slight greenish tint visible at certain angles. When I placed my hand against the surface, I expected coolness, but instead felt an unnatural warmth, as if the glass had been sitting in sunlight, despite the hallway's perpetual dimness. Behind the frame, barely visible in the narrow gap between mirror and wall, I discovered a small engraving. The lettering was worn but still legible: Videre quod videre non potest. My rudimentary Latin translated it roughly as, to see what cannot be seen. The phrase sent a surge of cold dread through my chest. A month into my tenancy, I began avoiding the hallway whenever possible. I'd take circuitous routes through my own apartment, pressing against the opposite wall when forced to pass the mirror. I kept my eyes averted, focusing on the floor, the ceiling, anywhere but the reflective surface. Still, I could feel something watching me from behind the glass, a presence that grew more palpable with each passing day. My ex-wife called to check in, concerned by my increasingly infrequent and disjointed text messages. Her voice on the speakerphone sounded distant as she asked if I was taking care of myself. I assured her I was fine, just adjusting to the new place, buried in work. When she suggested visiting, panic seized my throat. The thought of Lisa in the apartment walking past that mirror, exposed to whatever lurked behind it, was unbearable. I fabricated excuses about travel plans and deadlines until she reluctantly accepted my rejection. The truth was, I couldn't bear the thought of anyone else witnessing what was happening. Either they would see nothing, confirming my descent into madness, or worse, they would see what I saw, validating my growing terror. The incident that pushed me past my breaking point occurred 43 days after moving in. I was returning from a rare outing, dinner with colleagues that I'd forced myself to attend, when I heard it. Not the familiar soft knocking, but a single violent thud against the mirror, like a body thrown against glass. The sound reverberated through the empty apartment, stopping me cold at the entrance. I stood frozen in the doorway, keys clutched in my trembling hand, sweat instantly beading on my forehead despite the autumn chill. The hallway light flickered erratically, casting wild shadows across the walls. My breath came in shallow gasps as I forced myself to approach the mirror. The glass appeared intact, no cracks or distortions visible on its surface. But as I stared at my reflection, something shifted in the depths behind my image. My reflection's expression remained neutral, while terror contorted my actual face. Then, with deliberate slowness, my reflection's lips curved into a smile I wasn't making. I stumbled backward, my spine hitting the opposite wall with enough force to knock the air from my lungs. As I slid to the floor, legs suddenly unable to support my weight, the lights in the hallway stabilized. The mirror showed only my horrified expression, matching my actual face once more. But the damage was done. I'd seen the separation, the proof that what lived in the glass wasn't merely a reflection. I spent that night in my car, parked outside a 24-hour diner, too terrified to return to the apartment. When exhaustion finally overcame my fear around dawn, I made a decision. I couldn't abandon the apartment like the previous tenant. My finances wouldn't allow it. But I couldn't live with that mirror any longer. The specialist I found online described herself as an object historian with expertise in problematic artifacts. Dr. Eleanor Weiss arrived the next afternoon carrying a leather case filled with tools that looked more appropriate for an exorcism than an antique appraisal. A small woman in her 60s with silver hair and piercing eyes, she displayed none of the skepticism I'd come to expect when describing my experiences. She studied the mirror without touching it, circling it slowly while taking measurements and photographs. When I recounted the knocking, the shadows, and the reflection's independent movement, she nodded as if hearing a familiar story. According to Dr. Weiss, certain objects could become vessels for entities or energies under specific circumstances. The Latin inscription suggested this mirror had been created for scrying, a form of divination that opened doorways better left closed. Her explanation should have sounded ridiculous, the ravings of a charlatan. Instead, each word resonated with terrible truth, confirming what I already knew on a visceral level. Something had been invited into this mirror long ago, and now it was trying to come through. Dr. Weiss advised against removing or destroying the mirror. Such actions, she warned, might release whatever was contained within it. Instead, she performed what she called a binding ritual, placing small carved stones at each corner of the frame and applying a mixture of herbs and oils along its edges. She instructed me to maintain the binding by refreshing the oil weekly and never removing the stones. Before leaving, she fixed me with a solemn gaze. The entity was contained for now, she said, but bindings weakened over time. Her recommendation was clear: find another place to live, as soon as possible. That night, the knocking returned with renewed vigor. No longer the subtle taps I'd grown accustomed to, but violent pounding that shook the walls. The binding stones Dr. Weiss had placed vibrated against the floor, and the scent of her oils filled the hallway with a cloying sweetness that couldn't mask the underlying smell of decay, now emanating from the mirror. I retreated to the bedroom, wedging a chair against the door and wrapping myself in blankets despite the sweltering heat that had overtaken the apartment. The pounding continued for hours, occasionally interrupted by what sounded like fingernails dragging across glass. Around 2 a.m., a new sound emerged, a low, rhythmic humming that seemed to resonate directly inside my skull rather than through my ears. When silence finally fell near dawn, I knew it wasn't surrender but anticipation. Whatever dwelled in the mirror was gathering strength, preparing for something worse than noise and shadow play. Despite exhaustion clouding my thoughts, I formed a plan. I couldn't destroy the mirror, and I couldn't escape the apartment immediately, but perhaps I could counteract its influence. If the mirror was a doorway, maybe I could ensure it remained closed from my side. Over the next 3 days, I transformed the hallway. Following both Dr. Weiss's instructions and remedies gathered from esoteric websites, I lined the walls with protective symbols drawn in charcoal and salt. I hung iron nails above and beside the mirror, materials that supposedly repelled certain entities. I placed electric lights at both ends of the hallway, keeping the space illuminated day and night to eliminate shadows where something might hide. The mirror fought back. Bulbs burned out within hours of replacement. Salt lines scattered without explanation. The protective symbols I'd drawn would be smudged or altered when I returned after stepping away for even a moment. The binding oil Dr. Weiss had applied evaporated faster than should have been possible, requiring constant reapplication. Sleep became a distant memory. I existed in a haze of caffeine and adrenaline, jumping at every creak and shadow. My work suffered. Deadlines passed unmet. Friends stopped calling after repeated cancellations and incoherent excuses. The mirror consumed my entire existence. I began to question my sanity, wondering if stress and isolation had fractured my grip on reality. Yet each time doubt crept in, something would happen to validate my fears. A glimpse of movement in the glass when I stood motionless, the sudden drop in temperature when I approached the mirror, the persistent smell of something rotting behind the wall. Last night, everything changed. I woke from a rare moment of sleep to absolute silence. The constant background hum of the apartment, the refrigerator, heating system, even the electric hum of light bulbs, had ceased. Perfect stillness filled every room, as if the air itself had solidified. I rose from bed on unsteady legs and moved to the bedroom doorway. The hallway beyond lay in darkness despite the multiple lights I'd installed. The mirror's surface gleamed with an internal luminescence, casting just enough ghostly light to reveal its frame. As I watched, paralyzed between fear and morbid fascination, the glass began to ripple like disturbed water. The surface bulged outward, stretching as if something pushed against it from the other side. The wood frame creaked under pressure, the binding stones glowing red where they touched the carved oak. My heart hammered against my ribs with such force I feared it might burst. Sweat drenched my clothes despite the bone-deep chill that had descended over the apartment. I wanted to run, to flee the building entirely, but my body refused to obey, locked in place by terror and dark curiosity. The glass continued to distend, the surface now protruding several inches from the frame. Behind the warped reflection, I could make out a shape, not my own reflected image, but something else. A face pressed against the barrier, features distorted beyond recognition. Fingers, too long and too numerous, splayed across the surface from within, pushing, testing for weakness. Then, With a sound like ice cracking on a frozen lake, the bulging glass began to recede. The pressure withdrawn, the binding stones dimmed, and the mirror's surface gradually returned to its normal flat state. As it did, I heard a voice, not audible through my ears but resonating directly in my mind. 3 words, distinct and terrifying in their clarity. Soon. Very soon. The lights flickered back to life. The apartment's normal sounds resumed as if someone had unmuted the world. I stood trembling in the doorway, certain of one thing only. The binding had nearly failed. Whatever existed behind that glass was finding its way through. This morning I've made my decision. I won't flee like the previous tenant, abandoning the problem for someone else to inherit. I've researched properties with connections to mirrors and reflective surfaces, wells, certain lakes, caves with still pools of water. Places where the barrier between worlds might be thinner, where something could pass through more easily than through the increasingly resistant glass in my hallway. I found a suitable location an hour's drive from the city, an abandoned quarry flooded with groundwater, creating a perfectly still pool surrounded by sheer rock faces. Tonight, when the moon reaches its zenith, I'll take the mirror there, not to destroy it, but to provide an alternative path. If Dr. Weiss is correct about entities requiring invitation, then I'll extend one, not into our world through the mirror in my hallway, but from the mirror into someplace else, someplace uninhabited. I've prepared the necessary symbols and words, drawn from texts I'm not entirely sure I understand. I know the risk. Whatever dwells behind that glass may not accept my offer. It may focus its rage on me when it realizes my intent. But I cannot continue living in fear, watching the binding weaken day by day, waiting for the glass to shatter and release whatever waits behind it. As I write these words, the knocking has begun again. No longer against the glass, but within the walls themselves, as if testing the boundaries of its prison. I feel its anticipation, its hunger. Tonight, one way or another, it ends. Either I succeed in redirecting this entity, or, well, I've left this account in case I don't return. If you're reading this, and you encounter an antique mirror with a carved oak frame in your new home, do what I should have done from the beginning. Run. The first time I heard the scraping sound above my bedroom ceiling, I dismissed it as the house settling. Old structures make noise, that's what I told myself. But when the dragging continued, slow and deliberate, as if someone were rearranging furniture in the small hours of the morning, I began to question my decision to rent this place. Some savings aren't worth the cost. I'd found the listing 2 months ago, a 2-bedroom house on the outskirts of Millfield, priced suspiciously below market rate. The commute to my accounting job downtown would be longer, but I could finally start putting away money for a down payment on my own place. The landlord, Mr. Hargrove, was eager to rent it out. Too eager, I now realize. When I toured the property, I noticed a small hatch in the hallway ceiling. Mr. Hargrove had waved dismissively when I asked about it, explaining it led to a cramped attic space that wasn't part of the rental agreement. Just storage for some of the house's original insulation materials, he said. Nothing worth seeing. The hatch had no pull-down ladder, and he claimed the only access was through the roof outside. A deliberate choice to prevent tenants from storing their belongings up there and potentially damaging the ceiling. The scratching and dragging sounds started during my 3rd week. I work late most nights, often returning home after midnight. The first few times I blamed the neighbor's cat, thinking it must be climbing on the roof. But cats don't weigh enough to make the ceiling creak, and they certainly don't drag heavy objects across attic floors. I tried calling Mr. Hargrove several times. When he finally answered, his voice sounded strained, as he insisted there must be raccoons or squirrels that had found their way in through the eaves. He promised to send someone to check it out, but weeks passed with no sign of pest control. The sounds developed a pattern. They would begin shortly after I arrived home, usually starting with light footsteps traversing the length of the attic, followed by that distinctive dragging noise. Sometimes it sounded like furniture being rearranged, other times like something heavy being pulled across the floor. On nights when I worked even later than usual, the sounds would be waiting for me, as if whoever or whatever was up there had grown impatient. What disturbed me most was the realization that my presence triggered the activity. If I left the television on when I went to the bathroom, the sounds would stop until I returned to the room. It was as if whatever occupied the attic could sense when I was alone and unguarded. Sleep became elusive. I found myself lying awake, ears straining to track the movements above me. My work performance began to suffer. Dark circles formed under my eyes, and colleagues commented on my disheveled appearance. I brushed off their concerns with mumbled excuses about insomnia. After 6 weeks of this psychological torture, I decided to investigate. I requested a day off work, my first in months, and waited for a bright, sunny afternoon when the attic shadows would be minimized. The night before, I purchased a powerful flashlight, a hammer, and a small pry bar. If Mr. Hargrove wouldn't help me, I would help myself. The hallway hatch was sealed with paint around its edges, suggesting it hadn't been opened in years. It took considerable effort to break the seal. With each strike of the hammer against the pry bar, particles of dust and paint chips rained down on my face. My heart pounded against my ribs, and sweat trickled down my temples. But it wasn't just from the physical exertion. When the hatch finally gave way, a rush of stale, musty air descended from the dark space above. The smell was peculiar. Not just the expected dust and mildew, but something else I couldn't identify. Something vaguely organic. I extended the flashlight into the darkness, its beam revealing rough wooden beams and ancient insulation. There was no built-in ladder, so I dragged my dining table beneath the opening and stacked a chair on top. The makeshift arrangement looked precarious, but it held my weight as I climbed up and hoisted myself through the hatch. The attic was larger than Mr. Hargrove had implied, though the peaked roof meant I couldn't stand fully upright except in the center. The space extended over the entire house. Thick dust covered the floorboards, undisturbed in most areas, except for a clear path that cut through the center of the room. My flashlight beam revealed distinct footprints in the dust. Not the tiny paws of rodents or the larger prints of raccoons, but something that resembled human footprints, yet not quite. They were elongated and oddly spaced, as if whoever left them had an unnatural gait. The tracks led from the hatch toward the far corner of the attic, where the roof sloped to meet the floor. As I followed the trail, my breathing became shallow and rapid. The air felt thicker here, heavy with something beyond dust. My flashlight beam trembled as I approached the corner, where the footprints seemed to disappear into the wall itself. Upon closer inspection, I noticed a small gap between the wall and the roofline, a narrow crawl space that continued beyond the visible area of the attic. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. An involuntary shiver ran down my spine, despite the stifling heat of the enclosed space. Something in that dark recess was watching me. I could feel it with a certainty that transcended rational thought. A heaviness pressed against my consciousness, a presence that was aware of me just as I was becoming aware of it. The silence was absolute. Even the normal creaking of the house had ceased, as if the structure itself was holding its breath. In that moment of perfect stillness, I heard it. A soft exhalation from the darkness beyond the gap. Not an animal sound, not the wind, something deliberate. I backpedaled so quickly I nearly fell through the open hatch. My elbow struck one of the roof beams, sending a shaft of pain up my arm, but I barely noticed. Adrenaline propelled me as I scrambled down my makeshift ladder, nearly toppling the chair and table in my haste. Back in the hallway, I slammed the hatch closed and dragged the heaviest piece of furniture I could manage, my dresser beneath it. My hands shook violently as I called Mr. Hargrove, my voice cracking as I demanded answers. This time, he picked up on the first ring, as if he'd been waiting for my call. He listened to my breathless account without interruption. When I finished, the line went silent for so long I thought we'd been disconnected. Finally, he spoke in a measured tone I hadn't heard from him before. He explained that the previous tenant had reported similar disturbances. Mr. Hargrove admitted he'd hoped the situation had resolved itself during the months the house stood vacant. I pressed him for details. my frustration mounting as he spoke in vague terms about the house's peculiarities. He suggested that some spaces develop their own awareness over time, a ridiculous notion I would have dismissed outright under different circumstances. But after what I'd experienced, his words found fertile ground in my imagination. Mr. Hargrove offered to refund my security deposit if I wanted to break the lease. The fact that he made this offer without argument only heightened my suspicion that he knew far more than he was telling me. I should have accepted, should have packed my belongings that very afternoon, and found a hotel until I secured new accommodations. Instead, a perverse curiosity took hold. I convinced myself there must be a logical explanation. Perhaps someone was accessing the attic from outside, using it as a squatting place while I was at work. This would explain why the activity increased when I was home. The trespasser was trying to intimidate me, to make me leave so they could have free reign of the property. I installed motion-activated cameras around the exterior of the house, focusing on the roof access points. I placed a digital voice recorder in the attic, carefully setting it near the disturbing footprints before resealing the hatch and replacing my barricade. Then I waited. For 3 nights, nothing happened. The attic remained silent, as if whatever dwelled there knew it was being monitored. On the 4th night, exhausted from lack of sleep and beginning to doubt my own recollections, I returned from work to find the house unnervingly quiet. I reviewed the camera footage. Nothing. Not a single triggered recording over 4 days. The voice recorder, however, had activated multiple times. The first few recordings captured only the ambient sounds of the house. The hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the wall clock, the occasional car passing on the distant road. The final recording began with the same ambient noise, then captured the distinct sound of my front door opening and closing as I left for work. 2 hours of silence followed. I was about to fast forward when I heard it. That familiar dragging sound, much clearer now that the recorder was in the attic itself. Then came the footsteps, slow, methodical, with an uneven rhythm that suggested a limp or some other irregularity. They approached the recorder, growing louder until they stopped, presumably right next to the device. What followed turns my blood to ice even now as I recall it. Breathing. Deep, ragged breathing, punctuated by what sounded like sniffing, as if whatever was up there was trying to catch a scent. My scent. After several minutes of this, a voice spoke. It was so distorted and guttural that I initially mistook it for interference on the recording. But as I replayed those moments repeatedly, the words became unmistakable. Coming home soon. My phone rang, startling me so badly I dropped the recorder. It was Mr. Hargrove. Before I could speak, he asked if I'd been in the attic again. There was an edge to his voice I hadn't heard before, something close to panic. I admitted I had and told him about the recordings. His response was immediate and forceful. He told me to leave the house right away, to pack nothing, just get in my car and drive to the address he would text me. He said he would explain everything once I was safely away from the property. As I stood there, phone in hand, processing his urgent instructions, the power went out. The house plunged into darkness so complete I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. And in that perfect darkness, I heard the unmistakable sound of the attic hatch opening. The dresser I'd placed as a barricade scraped across the hallway floor, pushed aside by a force that shouldn't have been possible from above. My muscles locked in terror as something heavy dropped down from the ceiling with a thud that vibrated through the floorboards. In the darkness, I heard those uneven footsteps approaching, the same distinctive rhythm captured on the recording. My paralysis broke. I bolted for the front door, fumbling with the lock as those footsteps closed the distance behind me. The night air hit my face as I burst outside, not daring to look back as I sprinted to my car. The engine roared to life, headlights illuminating the empty porch as I reversed down the driveway with reckless speed. I drove straight to the address Mr. Hargrove sent, a small motel on the highway heading out of town. He was waiting in the parking lot, looking older and more haggard than I remembered. He handed me a room key and said we would talk in the morning. I tried to demand answers immediately, but he silenced me with a raised hand, his expression grave as he pointed out that something dark was smeared across the back of my shirt, something that looked disturbingly like soil mixed with black ichor. I haven't returned to the house. Mr. Hargrove arranged for movers to collect my belongings, though several items were reported missing, including the recorder with its disturbing evidence. The police report I filed was met with skepticism, then closed due to insufficient evidence of criminal activity. I've since learned that the house has had 7 tenants in the past decade, none staying longer than 3 months. Local rumors suggest the land was once part of a larger property with a troubled history, though details are frustratingly scarce. Sometimes, in the darkest hours of night, I wake to the sound of uneven footsteps in the hallway outside my new apartment. I tell myself it's just a neighbor returning home late, but deep down, I know better, because whatever was in that attic didn't just want the house to itself. It wanted company, and I have the unsettling feeling it's still looking for exactly that. The static from antique radios has always carried something more than mere interference. In the gaps between frequencies, in the whispers behind white noise, something waits. I know this now. The knowledge sits like ice in my stomach, a frozen weight I carry everywhere. My 1950s Philco table radio sits facing the wall, draped with a heavy woolen blanket, unplugged. And yet sometimes, I still hear it breathing. I still feel it watching. I know what lurks in those ancient circuits, in that bakelite shell the color of dried blood. And I know it knows me. My name is Daniel Reed, and I collect old electronics. Not valuable stuff necessarily, not museum pieces, just everyday objects from decades past. Telephones with actual dials, cassette players, tube televisions. There's something about the weight of them, the solidity. Modern tech is all glass and air, weightless and disposable. But these old machines? They were built to last. They have presence. They have soul. That's what I thought anyway. Before. I found the radio at a church rummage sale 3 months ago, tucked between a fondue set and a stack of Reader's Digest condensed books. It was a 1952 Philco 53561, mahogany veneer over its rounded frame, brass dial, cloth speaker cover. The price tag read $15. I didn't even haggle. The elderly woman who took my money mentioned that it had belonged to her brother, who had passed away recently. She seemed eager to be rid of it, almost relieved when I handed over the bills. I should have recognized the warning in her eyes. At home, I cleared a space on my bookshelf and plugged it in. The warm amber glow of the dial was hypnotic as I turned it carefully, searching for a signal. Nothing but static crackled through the speaker. I wasn't surprised. Analog AM signals are increasingly rare these days. I tried different positions, different times of day. Sometimes I caught snippets of talk radio, farm reports, a preacher shouting about salvation. Nothing worth listening to. I decided the radio would be purely decorative, a conversation piece. That first night, I woke at 3:17 a.m. The red numbers of my digital alarm clock burned in the darkness, and underneath them a sound, a soft, persistent hiss, static, but somehow more focused than random noise, more intentional. I sat up in bed, trying to identify the source in my half-asleep state, the bookshelf, the radio. But I had turned it off. I stumbled across the room and felt for the knob. It was indeed in the off position. Yet the static continued, a gentle susurration like distant ocean waves. I unplugged it. The sound continued. A chill prickled the back of my neck, but I dismissed it as the remnant charge in the capacitors, something technical that would fade. I returned to bed, pulled the covers tight, and eventually fell back asleep with the soft static as a strange lullaby. The next day, I examined the radio more closely. The wiring seemed intact, no obvious shorts or issues. When I plugged it in and turned it on during daylight, it behaved normally. Normal in its dysfunction, that is. Just the expected static and occasional distant station. I convinced myself that my midnight experience had been a dream, or at worst, a half-awake hallucination. That night, I awoke again. 3:17 a.m. exactly. The static was there but altered. Within it, I could discern patterns. Not words exactly, but the cadence of speech, the rise and fall of questions, the finality of statements, like listening to conversation through a thick wall. I stared at the radio from my bed, its dial glowing more intensely than it should have, given that it was turned off and unplugged. My heart thudded against my ribs as I approached it. The static modulated as I drew near, the pseudo-voices growing more distinct. One seemed to rise above the others, a slightly higher pitch. I leaned closer, straining to understand. And then, buried in the white noise but unmistakable, my name. Daniel. My body reacted before my mind could process what was happening. I jerked back, knocking the radio to the floor. The static stopped immediately. In the sudden silence, my ragged breathing sounded obscenely loud. I left the radio on the floor until morning, when daylight rendered the experience distant and almost comical. Audio pareidolia, I told myself. The human brain's tendency to find patterns in random noise, like seeing faces in wood grain or clouds. I picked up the radio. No damage from the fall. I replaced it on the shelf, but left it unplugged. For 3 nights, nothing happened. I slept soundly, and the radio remained silent. I began to relax. Then, on the 4th night, 3:17 a.m., static, louder than before. This time the voices were clearer, multiple speakers engaged in what sounded like an urgent discussion. Among the unintelligible murmurs, occasional words emerged with crystal clarity. Soon, and waiting, and ready. And again, my name, called not once but repeatedly, with increasing insistence. My skin went cold and clammy as I sat rigid in my bed, watching the radio. The dial glowed with an unnatural bluish tint now, not the warm amber it should have been. My throat constricted. I couldn't call out, couldn't move. Then something shifted in the static, a sound like a door opening. The voices fell silent. A new sound emerged, breathing, slow, deliberate breathing, as if something had pressed its mouth directly against the speaker. My paralysis broke. I lunged across the room, grabbed the radio, and shoved it into my closet, burying it under a pile of winter clothes. The breathing stopped. I spent the remainder of the night with all the lights on, checking my phone obsessively. The internet told me what I wanted to hear. Old radios could pick up strange frequencies, interference from nearby electronics, crossed signals from emergency broadcasts. Rational explanations abounded. The next day, I considered disposing of the radio but couldn't bring myself to do it. Instead, I placed it on my kitchen counter, in full view, where sunlight would hit it throughout the day. I wouldn't give it the power that darkness and isolation provided. I even turned it on deliberately, tuning it to static, letting it play as I prepared dinner. Ordinary, expected static, nothing hidden in its hiss. That night, I took a sleeping pill and went to bed early. I slept deeply until that now familiar time. 3:17 a.m. But this time, the static didn't wake me. What woke me was silence, the utter absence of sound, the kind of silence that feels like pressure against your eardrums. I opened my eyes to find the radio on my nightstand, its dial glowing that unnatural blue. I hadn't moved it from the kitchen. My mouth dried instantly. My tongue felt like sandpaper. The silence stretched, became intolerable. And then a voice spoke, not through the radio but directly behind me. It whispered my name in a voice that seemed composed of several voices speaking in unison. I felt breath against my ear, cold and damp. My muscles seized. Sweat erupted across my body, soaking my shirt in seconds. I couldn't turn, couldn't look. Something told me that seeing the source of that voice would be the end of me. The radio dial flickered, and suddenly the static returned. The presence behind me vanished. I sat frozen until dawn gradually lightened my window blinds. Only then did I dare to move, to touch the radio. It was ice cold, despite the glowing dial. I carried it at arm's length to the bathroom and locked it in the cabinet beneath the sink. My research became obsessive after that. I scoured online forums for similar experiences with vintage radios. Most were obviously fabricated creepypastas, but a few accounts rang with authentic terror. One man in Idaho claimed his 1940s RCA had channeled his dead wife's voice. A woman in Maine described hearing coordinates repeated night after night from an unplugged transistor radio, coordinates that led to an unmarked grave in the woods behind her house. Most disturbing was an archived forum post from 2003 describing a Philco model identical to mine. The poster claimed to have traced its origin to a specific factory where, in 1952, a worker had committed suicide by electrocution using radio components. The factory had continued production, allegedly incorporating the damaged parts into subsequent models. The post ended abruptly, mid-sentence. The account had never posted again. I began to avoid sleep. I stayed awake until exhaustion forced my eyes closed, usually as dawn was breaking. For 2 days, this worked. On the third day, I fell asleep at my computer around midnight. I dreamed of a vast room filled with radios of every size and era, all tuned to static, all speaking my name in chorus. In the center of the room stood a man in factory coveralls, his features indistinct except for his eyes, which glowed the same unnatural blue as my radio's dial. He was beckoning me forward. I woke to find myself standing in my bathroom, the cabinet under the sink open, the radio in my hands. The dial read 3:17 a.m., but the radio was silent. I stared at my reflection in the mirror above the sink. My eyes looked wrong somehow, flatter, emptier. I watched my reflection's lips move, forming words I wasn't consciously speaking. "We've been waiting for you, Daniel." My hands shook so violently that I dropped the radio into the sink. I scrambled backward until I hit the shower curtain, tangling myself in its plastic folds. In the sink, the radio began to emit a high-pitched tone that made my teeth vibrate. I covered my ears, but the sound seemed to bypass them entirely, resonating directly in my skull. The mirror fogged over, despite there being no hot water running. Condensation formed intricate patterns across its surface, not random droplets but deliberate shapes. Words, a message forming letter by letter. "Your turn soon." I fled the bathroom, slamming the door behind me. The tone stopped instantly. I stood in my hallway, gasping for breath, my heart slamming against my ribs so hard I feared it might rupture. I didn't return to the bathroom until morning. The radio sat innocently in the sink. The mirror was clear, no message, no condensation. But the radio's dial had been turned to a specific frequency, 31.7 on the AM band. I took the radio to work that day, not wanting to leave it alone in my apartment. My coworkers commented on the vintage piece, asked if it worked. I smiled weakly and claimed it was just for show. I kept it on my desk, under the fluorescent lights, where nothing supernatural could possibly manifest. During my lunch break, I researched frequency 31.7 AM. It wasn't assigned to any broadcaster. It existed in what radio enthusiasts called a dead zone, frequencies allocated but unused, empty airways where only static should exist. That evening, I considered my options. Destroying the radio seemed obvious, but something told me that would only make things worse, like cutting off a hydra's head. I decided on containment instead. I drove to a hardware store and purchased a small fireproof safe, the kind designed for protecting documents. It was lined with steel and had a combination lock. I placed the radio inside, closed it, spun the dial. For good measure, I wrapped the safe in layers of aluminum foil, creating a makeshift Faraday cage. I placed the wrapped safe in the far corner of my living room and, for the first time in days, prepared for a normal night's sleep. As I drifted off, I felt genuine hope that I had solved the problem. The dream came immediately. I was in a vast factory space, old machinery looming in shadows. A production line stretched before me, where partially assembled radios moved slowly along a conveyor belt. Workers in period clothing stood at their stations, their faces blurred and indistinct. Except for one, a man at the end of the line, installing dials on the finished radios. He looked directly at me with those blue glowing eyes. He smiled, revealing teeth that were small and sharp, like needles. "We've been trying to reach you," he said, his voice the same multi-layered sound I'd heard from the radio. "Your frequency is compatible. Your wavelength resonates with ours." I tried to back away, but my feet were suddenly tangled in cords and wires that snaked up from the floor, wrapping around my ankles. "Every radio needs a voice," the man continued, approaching me now. "Every transmission needs a source." He held up a Philco radio, my radio. "This one lost its voice. We need a replacement." The wires continued their upward journey, wrapping around my calves, my thighs, my torso. I opened my mouth to scream, but a thin copper wire shot between my lips, slithering down my throat. I woke violently, my body jackknifing upright. My throat felt raw, as if something had indeed been forced down it. The bedside clock read 3:16 a.m. I had 1 minute. I threw myself out of bed, planning to leave the apartment entirely, to get as far from the radio as possible before 3:17 struck. Too late. My living room was bathed in that blue glow. The safe sat open, the aluminum foil unwrapped and scattered. The radio sat on my coffee table, its dial turned to 31.7, static hissing from its speaker. But the static was changing, organizing itself into a pattern I now recognized as speech. The factory man's voice emerged, no longer constrained by the limitations of the radio's speaker, as clear as if he stood before me. "Your turn, Daniel," he said. "Your voice, our channel, forever." The static surged, becoming a physical force that pushed me backward. I stumbled, fell onto the couch. The radio's glow intensified until it was painfully bright. I shielded my eyes with my arm. Through my fingers, I saw the dial moving by itself, scanning rapidly through frequencies before stopping again at 31.7. The static ceased. In its place came my own voice, perfectly reproduced. "Help me. Oh God, somebody help me. I'm trapped in here. I can't get out." The shock of hearing myself broke whatever spell had held me. I lunged forward, grabbed the radio, and ran to my kitchen. I shoved it into the refrigerator and slammed the door, muffling but not eliminating my voice, still pleading from within the radio. I fled my apartment, spent the night in my car in a well-lit parking lot. When I returned in the morning, the radio was back on the coffee table. But something had changed. It looked older, more worn. The veneer was chipped in places that had been pristine before. The cloth speaker cover was faded and frayed at one corner. Most disturbing of all, scratched into the wood on the back was a name. Daniel. My name. Not written by me. I understood then. The factory worker hadn't been trying to take my voice. He had been trying to warn me. Because he had once been Daniel too, and before him, someone else. A chain of owners, all connected by more than just possession of the radio. Connected by name, by compatible frequency, by fate. I couldn't destroy it. I couldn't give it away. The elderly woman at the church sale had tried that, and the radio had simply found its way to me, to another Daniel. So now it sits in the corner of my room, facing the wall, covered with a thick blanket. I've tried leaving it in storage units, burying it, even locking it in the trunk of an abandoned car in a junkyard. It always returns. The only change I've managed to effect is temporal. I've shifted its active period. It no longer speaks at 3:17 a.m. Now it waits until 4:36 a.m., a time I calculated by adding each digit of my birth date. I don't sleep much anymore. When exhaustion overtakes me, I dream of the factory, of the assembly line that now includes me as one of its workers, installing speakers that whisper even as I connect their wires. I've taken to recording myself daily, creating audio evidence of my continued existence outside the radio. Sometimes I play these recordings at full volume during the radio's active period, as if to remind both it and myself who is the real Daniel. But lately, I've noticed something troubling about these recordings. When I play them back, there are gaps, brief moments of static, and sometimes, in the background, almost too faint to perceive, the sound of someone breathing, waiting. And I know, with terrible certainty, that one day I'll play back a recording and hear nothing but empty static. And from 31.7 on the AM band, in the dead of night, my voice will call out clearly, searching for the next Daniel in an endless chain of transmission that began long before 1952 and will continue long after I'm gone. Or perhaps I'm already gone. Perhaps I've been gone for some time. Perhaps what sits here typing these words, what walks through the world wearing my face, is merely an echo of Daniel Reed, a broadcast from a frequency of the damned. The moment I stepped into that old Victorian house, something felt wrong. A heaviness hung in the air, not like humidity or heat, but a pressure that seemed to push against my skin from all directions. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet with an almost deliberate slowness, as if the house itself was taking note of my arrival. I should have listened to that first instinct, that primal warning system we've all inherited from our ancestors, who knew better than to wander into places where they weren't welcome. But I ignored it, chalking it up to travel fatigue and the natural uneasiness of staying somewhere unfamiliar. My college buddy Mark had invited me to spend the weekend at his family home, a sprawling two-story Victorian that had been in his family for generations. When he mentioned the house was historic, I pictured charming vintage fixtures and maybe some outdated wallpaper, not this looming structure with its maze of narrow hallways and rooms that seemed to swallow light. Mark had apologized for putting me in the downstairs guest room rather than upstairs near his bedroom, explaining something about renovations making the upper floor crowded with furniture from other rooms. At the time, I'd shrugged it off. Now, as I wheeled my suitcase across the threshold of the guest room, I found myself wishing I'd insisted on a hotel. The guest room itself wasn't terrible, just small and outdated. Faded floral wallpaper peeled at the corners, and the heavy oak furniture looked like it hadn't been moved in decades. A thin layer of dust coated the dresser despite Mark's assurances that he'd cleaned before my arrival. The bed, at least, seemed comfortable enough, with fresh linens that smelled of laundry detergent rather than the musty odor that permeated the rest of the room. We spent that evening catching up over beers on the back porch, reminiscing about college days and filling each other in on the 5 years since graduation. Mark had changed. There was a weariness to him I hadn't noticed in our video calls. When I asked about it, he brushed it off, saying the family business was just keeping him busy. I didn't push it. By midnight, we'd both started yawning, and Mark showed me to the bathroom down the hall from my room before heading upstairs to his own bedroom. After a quick shower, I settled into bed, exhausted from the 6-hour drive. Sleep should have come easily, but something kept me hovering in that twilight state between wakefulness and dreaming. The house made sounds. All houses do, especially old ones, but these noises seemed to follow patterns. Creaks that responded to other creaks. Thumps that came in sequences of 3. And beneath it all, a constant, barely there whisper, like the static between radio stations. Around 1 a.m., the temperature dropped. Not gradually, as you'd expect from a heating system cycling off, but suddenly, as if someone had opened a freezer door inches from my face. My breath clouded in front of me, and the sweat that had gathered at my hairline from the stuffy room turned icy against my skin. Goosebumps erupted across my arms and chest as I pulled the quilted comforter up to my chin. The cold seemed to have substance, pressing against me through the blankets, seeking entrance like probing fingers. I told myself it was just poor insulation. These old houses were notorious for drafts. Maybe a window was cracked somewhere. The rational explanations comforted me, and I began to drift toward sleep again, until the footsteps started. At first they were faint, the gentle pad of sock-covered feet on hardwood. They moved slowly down the upstairs hallway, directly above my room. Mark going to the bathroom, I thought, but then the footsteps reached the staircase and began descending, each step deliberate and unhurried. My entire body tensed. I strained my ears, tracking the progress of whoever, or whatever, was coming downstairs. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs and paused. I held my breath, Heart thundering so loudly in my chest I was certain it could be heard throughout the house. After a moment that stretched into eternity, the steps resumed, moving down the hallway toward my room. They weren't Mark's footsteps. These were heavier, more deliberate, with a slight drag to the left foot. Just as they seemed to reach my door, they stopped. In the silence that followed, I could hear my own pulse pounding in my ears. Then, a soft click, and light spilled beneath my door as the hallway lamp switched on. Another click, and darkness returned. On, off. On, off. As if someone was testing the switch, or signaling. My throat constricted with fear as I watched the thin strip of space beneath my door, anticipating fingers or shadows to appear there. Nothing did. Instead, the footsteps retreated, moving from door to door down the hallway. With each pause came the clicking of lights. On, off, as if someone was checking each room. By the time the footsteps faded and the house fell silent again, my sheets were soaked with sweat despite the lingering cold. I lay awake until dawn painted the room in shades of gray, afraid to close my eyes, afraid to move, afraid to do anything that might remind whatever prowled the hallways that I was there. When morning finally broke, exhaustion had left me hollow-eyed and jittery. I found Mark in the kitchen, cheerfully making coffee as if nothing had happened. The normalcy of the scene, sunlight streaming through windows, the smell of coffee and toast, made the night's events seem distant and dreamlike. Carefully, trying to sound casual, I asked if he'd been downstairs during the night. The question made him pause mid-pour, the coffee hovering above his mug. His expression flickered, confusion, then something I couldn't quite identify, before he said he'd slept soundly upstairs all night and hadn't set foot on the ground floor until morning. He hadn't heard anything unusual either. When I described the footsteps and the lights, he frowned thoughtfully before suggesting old wiring might explain the lights, and the house settling could account for the sounds. His explanation was reasonable, but the look in his eyes didn't match his dismissive words. There was worry there, carefully masked but unmistakable. I spent the day distracted, going through the motions as Mark showed me around town. We visited a local brewery, walked through the historic district, and had lunch at his favorite diner. But my mind kept returning to those footsteps, to the methodical checking of doors, to the bone-deep cold that had invaded my room. By the time we returned to the house that evening, dread had settled in my stomach like a lead weight. Mark must have noticed my unease. He suggested watching movies in the living room until late, subtly delaying bedtime without acknowledging why. I was grateful for it. But eventually, fatigue won out, and we both retreated to our rooms around 1 a.m. I lay in bed, every muscle tense, listening for any sound out of place. The house seemed quieter than the previous night, almost deliberately so, as if it was holding its breath. I checked my phone. 1:47 a.m., still early. The night stretched ahead of me, long and uncertain. At precisely 2 a.m., the cold returned. This time, I was prepared for it, having layered on a sweatshirt over my t-shirt before getting into bed. What I wasn't prepared for was how much more intense it would be. The previous night's chill had been uncomfortable. This was painful. The air burned my lungs with each breath. My fingers grew numb despite being tucked under the blankets. Frost patterns began forming on the inside of the window, spreading like skeletal fingers across the glass. The footsteps, when they came, were different too. No longer cautious and exploring, they moved with purpose. Down the stairs, along the hallway, straight to my door. No checking other rooms, no flickering lights. Whatever had been searching last night had found what it was looking for. My door had no lock, just an old-fashioned brass knob with a keyhole that hadn't seen a key in decades. I watched, paralyzed with terror, as the knob began to turn slowly, metal scraping against metal in the silence. My breath caught in my throat. The door, thank God, stuck slightly in its frame. A quirk of old houses where nothing quite fits anymore, and the knob turned back to its original position. A pause, then it began turning again, more forcefully this time. Adrenaline surged through me, breaking my paralysis. I lunged from the bed and pressed my full weight against the door, trapping my foot against the base to block any attempt to push it open. The knob stopped turning immediately. For several heartbeats, nothing happened. Then slowly, the knob began turning in the opposite direction, as if whoever was on the other side was testing the mechanism. A sound escaped me, something between a gasp and a whimper, and instantly, all movement ceased. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by my ragged breathing. Gathering every ounce of courage, I yanked the door open, prepared to confront whatever was there. The hallway was empty, but the air in the hallway rippled, like heat waves rising from summer pavement, and the lights began to flicker, not just one, but all of them, in perfect synchronization. On, off, faster and faster, until it became a strobe effect that sent shadows leaping and dancing along the walls. The shadows moved against the light, twisting into shapes that almost resembled a human figure, but elongated and distorted, with limbs that bent at impossible angles. I slammed the door shut and wedged a chair under the knob, backing away until I hit the opposite wall. My heart hammered so violently I feared it might crack my ribs. Sweat poured down my face despite the freezing temperature. The logical part of my brain scrambled for explanations. Power surge, hallucination from sleep deprivation, overactive imagination, but none of them stuck. What I'd seen in those flickering lights defied rational explanation. For hours, I sat on the bed, back pressed against the headboard, eyes fixed on the door. The lights in the hallway continued their frantic pattern, visible in the thin strip beneath the door, but no further attempts were made to enter my room. By the time dawn broke, my eyes burned from staying open so long, and my body ached from being held tense for hours. I waited until I heard Mark moving around upstairs before venturing out of my room. The hallway looked perfectly normal in the morning light, no sign of the electrical chaos from the night before. When I examined the light switches, they worked flawlessly, with no flickering or hesitation. Over breakfast, I tried to broach the subject again. This time, instead of dismissing my concerns, Mark grew quiet. He stared into his coffee cup for a long moment before asking, in a carefully neutral tone, if I'd actually seen anyone in the hallway. When I described the rippling air and the shadows that moved wrong, something like relief crossed his face. Finally, he admitted that strange things had been happening in the house since his grandmother died 6 months ago. Nothing dangerous, he hastened to add, just unsettling. Lights with minds of their own. Footsteps when no one was there. Cold spots that came and went. His father had the wiring checked, the heating system inspected, even brought in a team to look for drafts or structural issues. They found nothing. What Mark said next chilled me more than any ghostly encounter. His grandmother had been the house's caretaker for decades, maintaining certain old traditions she claimed kept the family safe. After her death, no one knew exactly what these traditions entailed or how to continue them. Mark's father dismissed it all as superstition, but Mark wasn't so sure. The disturbances had started small, easily attributed to imagination or coincidence, but had grown increasingly difficult to ignore. The guest room where I was staying had been his grandmother's room. I packed my bags within the hour. Mark didn't try to convince me to stay. If anything, he seemed relieved I was leaving. As I loaded my car, he stood awkwardly on the porch, hands shoved in his pockets. Before I left, he pressed something into my palm, a small weathered brass key that looked ancient. It wasn't for me to keep, he explained, just to return if I ever found myself thinking too much about the house or feeling drawn back to it. The way he said it made it clear this wasn't a theoretical concern. It had happened before. I've kept the key in my desk drawer since returning home. Sometimes, late at night, I find myself standing there with the drawer open, staring at that small piece of metal. I never touch it. But sometimes, I could swear it's moved from where I left it. And on particularly cold nights, I wake to the sound of footsteps in my apartment hallway, and the faint, rhythmic clicking of a light switch. On, off, on, off. Searching. The silence in this place isn't peaceful, it's expectant. That's what I've come to understand after 2 months in this house. What I once mistook for tranquility was merely the world holding its breath, waiting for something I couldn't yet perceive. Now, as I lie awake at 2:57 a.m., muscles tensed beneath sweat-dampened sheets, I know exactly what it's waiting for. I moved to 117 Oakwood Lane seeking an escape from city life. My tech job had gone remote, and the pandemic had taught me I didn't need the constant hum of urban existence to feel alive. What I needed was space. Quiet. A place where my thoughts wouldn't have to compete with the cacophony of 1,000 strangers living their lives in proximity to mine. The realtor had been almost apologetic about how isolated the property was. The nearest neighbor a quarter-mile down the winding rural road, the town center a 15-minute drive away. Perfect, I'd thought. Absolutely perfect. The first few weeks fulfilled every promise of the peaceful retreat I'd envisioned. I'd wake to birdsong instead of traffic, work on my porch overlooking dense woods, and fall asleep to a silence so complete it felt like a physical presence. I remembered thinking how strange it was that something so empty could feel so substantial. Then came that first night, exactly 1 month after I'd moved in. The digital clock on my nightstand had just blinked to 3 a.m. when the shrill, demanding ring of the doorbell tore through the silence. My heart launched into my throat as I bolted upright, disoriented and alarmed. Who could possibly be at my door at this hour, on this isolated road? The second ring compelled me to action. I grabbed my phone, ready to call emergency services, and made my way downstairs. The house was cool, but perspiration beaded along my hairline and dampened my palms as I approached the front door. The peephole revealed only darkness. The porch light I was certain I'd left on had somehow gone out. Against my better judgment, driven by a curiosity that overwhelmed my fear, I cracked the door open. Nothing. No one. Just the still night air and the soft chorus of crickets. I stepped onto the porch, scanning the driveway and the tree line beyond. My breath condensed in the unexpectedly cold air as I called out, asking if anyone was there. Only the distant hoot of an owl answered. Convincing myself it had been some teenagers from town playing a prank, I returned inside, double-checking the locks before returning to bed. Sleep eluded me until dawn painted my ceiling with pale golden light. I spent the day installing a motion-activated floodlight above my porch, telling myself I was being practical, not paranoid. The following night dispelled any notion that I had been the victim of a random prank. Again, at exactly 3 a.m., the doorbell's insistent ring jolted me from a fitful sleep. This time I was prepared. I grabbed the baseball bat I'd placed beside my bed and moved quickly downstairs. Before opening the door, I checked the window. The newly installed floodlight was blazing, illuminating my empty front yard in harsh white light. No cars in the driveway, no footprints disturbing the gravel, no movement triggering the sensitive light. Yet the doorbell had definitely rung. Heart hammering against my ribs, mouth dry as sandpaper, I opened the door just a crack. Again, nothing. The floodlight cast long, distorted shadows across my porch, but revealed no visitors, welcome or otherwise. A gust of wind, unusually cold for early autumn, slipped through the crack in the door and raised goosebumps along my arms. That's when I noticed something I had missed the previous night. The faint scent of tobacco smoke, despite there being no visible source. I slammed the door shut, the sound echoing through my empty house like a gunshot. My hands trembled as I engaged all 3 locks, and I spent the remainder of the night on my couch, clutching my baseball bat, every muscle tense and ready. When morning came, I installed a security camera above my door, positioning it to capture anyone approaching the porch. The rational part of my brain suggested a faulty doorbell system, perhaps triggered by electrical surges or wildlife. The growing knot of dread in my stomach suggested otherwise. The third night brought no surprises, only the confirmation of my deepening fears. At precisely 3 a.m., the doorbell rang. This time, I was already awake, sitting in the darkness of my living room, facing the front door. The shrill sound cut through the silence like a knife, causing my entire body to jerk involuntarily. I waited, counting my ragged breaths, before approaching the door. The porch light was on. The security camera was recording. I opened the door to the same emptiness as before. With shaking hands, I closed the door and immediately went to my laptop to review the security footage. What I saw, or rather, what I didn't see, caused the room to tilt around me. The timestamp showed 3 a.m. The doorbell clearly rang in the audio, but there was absolutely no one visible on the recording. The button depressed on its own, as if pushed by an invisible finger. I spent the remainder of the night in my car, parked at a 24-hour diner in town, nursing cups of bitter coffee and researching the history of my property on my phone. What I discovered sent icy tendrils of fear crawling up my spine. The house at 117 Oakwood Lane had been built in the late 1970s by a man named Howard Mercer, a night shift worker at the now-defunct paper mill. According to local news archives, Mercer was known for returning home at odd hours, often around 3 a.m., following his shift and a few drinks at a bar that once operated near the mill. In 1986, Mercer vanished without a trace. His car was found parked in his garage. His wallet and keys were on the kitchen counter. His dinner dishes were still in the sink, but Howard Mercer was gone. The case went cold after a few months of fruitless investigation. The house remained empty for nearly 2 years before being sold, and since then had changed hands numerous times, never housing a single owner for more than a few years. The online forums and local history blogs painted a picture of a property that had developed a reputation for being uncomfortable or unsettling. Former residents reported unusual cold spots, unexplained noises, and a persistent feeling of being watched. None, however, had mentioned a doorbell ringing at 3 a.m. I returned home as the sun was rising, casting long shadows through the trees lining the driveway. In the harsh light of day, my fears seemed almost laughable. A faulty doorbell, an electrical issue, my own imagination running wild after discovering the house's history. I resolved to have an electrician inspect the wiring system and put the matter to rest. The local electrician who arrived that afternoon found nothing wrong with the doorbell system. He checked the wiring, the button mechanism, and even installed a new chime, assuring me that any issues had now been resolved. I thanked him, ignoring the skeptical look he gave me when I explained the 3 a.m. ringing. Before leaving, he hesitated on the porch, staring at the house with an unreadable expression. When I asked if something was wrong, he simply shook his head and suggested I consider having the house blessed. I laughed it off, but the sound rang hollow even to my own ears. That night, I prepared for a confrontation. I disabled the doorbell system entirely, physically disconnecting it from its power source. I set up additional cameras, covering every approach to the house. I left lights on throughout the first floor. I even considered spending the night elsewhere. But some stubborn part of me refused to be driven from my home by what was likely just an old house settling or an electrical quirk the technician had missed. At 2:45 a.m., I positioned myself in the living room, lights off, with a clear view of the front door. My mouth was dry, my heart already racing in anticipation. The minutes ticked by with excruciating slowness, each second stretching like taffy in the darkness. 3 a.m. arrived without incident. No ring, no sound at all except for my own ragged breathing and the soft ticking of the antique clock in the hallway. Relief washed over me, followed immediately by embarrassment at how worked up I'd become. I was just about to head upstairs when I heard it. Not the ring of the doorbell, but something far more unsettling. 3 distinct knocks on the front door. My blood turned to ice in my veins. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, as those 3 knocks echoed through the silent house. They weren't loud or aggressive, just firm, deliberate, as if whoever was knocking knew I was inside, knew I was listening, and was in no hurry. Minutes passed as I sat frozen in place. No further knocks came. Eventually, I forced myself to approach the door on legs that threatened to buckle beneath me. The peephole showed only my empty, well-lit porch. Against every instinct screaming within me, I opened the door. The night air rushed in, unusually cold and carrying that same faint scent of tobacco smoke. My security lights illuminated every corner of my front yard, revealing absolutely nothing out of place. But as I stood in the doorway, a sensation crept over me that I was not alone. It wasn't a sound or a sight. It was a presence, as tangible as a hand on my shoulder. I slammed the door shut and spent the remainder of the night huddled in my bedroom, lights blazing, checking and rechecking the security camera feeds on my laptop. They showed nothing. No visitors, no movement, no explanation for the knocks I'd heard so clearly. The following day, I drove to the local historical society, determined to learn more about Howard Mercer and the history of my property. The elderly volunteer who assisted me seemed unsurprised by my questions. She explained that while the official records showed Mercer as a missing person case never solved, local rumor had long held that he had met with foul play. Some suspected a drifter passing through town. Others whispered about gambling debts to dangerous people. A few even suggested he had simply walked into the woods behind his property one night and chosen never to return to a life that had grown unbearable after his wife's death years earlier. What caught my attention, though, was her mention of Mercer's routine. According to former co-workers, he had been almost obsessively punctual, arriving at exactly the same time for his shift each night. And each morning, he would return home at precisely 3 a.m., announcing his arrival with 3 knocks on his own front door, a habit he'd developed to avoid waking his wife with the doorbell during the years before her passing, and continued afterward out of ingrained routine. That night, I didn't even attempt to sleep. At 2:45 a.m., I sat in my living room, lights off, waiting. At precisely 3 a.m., the 3 knocks came again. Deliberate, patient, expectant. This time I approached the door immediately, my terror giving way to a strange, detached curiosity. I opened it without hesitation. The porch was empty, but the presence I'd felt the previous night was stronger, almost overwhelming. The tobacco scent hung heavy in the air, and despite the mild autumn night, my breath fogged in front of me. I found myself speaking aloud, asking if Howard Mercer was there, if he was trying to come home. No voice answered, but the porch light flickered once, twice, 3 times. That was 6 weeks ago. Every night since then, at exactly 3 a.m., 3 knocks sound on my front door. I've grown accustomed to it, even find myself waiting for it, a strange punctuation to my nights. I've learned that if I open the door immediately and acknowledge the presence with a simple greeting, the cold spot dissipates quickly and the night continues peacefully. If I ignore it, small disturbances plague my house until dawn. Lights flickering, doors creaking open, the persistent scent of tobacco growing stronger until it becomes almost suffocating. I've considered moving, of course, but some combination of fascination and compassion keeps me here. I understand now what Howard Mercer is doing. He's coming home, as he did every night for years. This is still his house in some fundamental way, and he is following the patterns etched into whatever remains of his existence. Last week, I established a new routine. At 2:55 a.m., I brew a cup of coffee and place it on the small table on the porch, beside an ashtray and a lit cigarette. At 3 a.m., the knocks come. I open the door, greet the empty porch, and then return to bed. By morning, the coffee cup is always empty, the cigarette burned down to the filter. The real estate agent never mentioned that my house came with a roommate who only exists at 3 a.m. But as the autumn chill deepens into winter, I find I don't mind sharing my isolated sanctuary with Howard Mercer. We've reached an understanding, this ghost and I. He's not trying to drive me away or harm me. He's simply coming home, as he has every night for decades, to the only place he still exists. Sometimes I wonder if I should be afraid. The rational part of my mind insists that I'm enabling my own delusion, creating rituals around coincidence and house noises. But when I wake in the night and sense that familiar presence moving through the rooms, never threatening, just present, I understand something profound about loneliness. Howard Mercer doesn't want to frighten me. He just doesn't want to be forgotten in the only space where memory of him persists. So I stay, marking each night with our strange communion. And sometimes, in those quietest hours between midnight and dawn, I catch myself wondering which of us is truly haunting this house on Oakwood Lane. The first night I spent in my father's house, I heard scratching from the walls. Not the familiar scurrying of mice or the gentle settling of an old structure, but deliberate, rhythmic scratching, as if something were trying to communicate. 3 slow drags followed by silence, then 3 more. I told myself it was just the house speaking its ancient language, the way all old buildings do. But deep down, I knew better. This house had secrets my father had taken to his grave, and something in the darkness was beckoning me to uncover them. My father, Maxwell Grant, died suddenly of a heart attack at 68. We weren't close. The kind of father and son who exchanged perfunctory phone calls on holidays and birthdays, our conversations circling around weather and sports scores, anything to avoid genuine connection. So when his lawyer called to inform me I'd inherited the sprawling Victorian house where he'd lived alone for the past 20 years, I was surprised. I hadn't set foot in that place since I was 18, when I left for college with no intention of returning. The house stood at the end of Blackwood Lane, partially hidden behind overgrown trees and shrubs that my father had long stopped maintaining. 3 stories of weathered brick and warped wood, with narrow windows that reflected no light even on the sunniest days. Growing up, the neighborhood kids called it the witch house, though none of us had ever seen a witch. Just my reclusive father, who grew more withdrawn with each passing year. Upon arrival, I was struck by how little had changed. The front door still creaked with that distinctive groan I remembered from childhood. The foyer smelled of pipe tobacco and old books, my father's scent. Dust particles danced in the shafts of afternoon light piercing through the windows. Time seemed to have abandoned this place, leaving it suspended in a permanent state of decay. I spent the first day exploring the first floor, the kitchen with its outdated appliances, the dining room where we'd eaten in silence, the study where my father would lock himself away for hours. On the second day, I ventured to the second floor, methodically going through each bedroom, bathroom, and closet, sorting through my father's possessions. I found nothing remarkable, just the mundane artifacts of a solitary life. But my eyes kept drifting to the ceiling, to the small trap door that led to the attic. As a child, that attic had been strictly forbidden. "That room isn't for playing," my father would say sharply whenever he caught me looking up at it. "Some doors should remain closed." His tone brooked no argument, and I learned to stop asking about it. Now, standing in the upstairs hallway with the house legally mine, I felt a magnetic pull toward that forbidden space. The trapdoor had a small brass handle that gleamed dully in the hallway light. My palm was slick with sweat as I reached up and pulled. The hinges protested with a screech that set my teeth on edge, and a narrow wooden staircase unfolded before me. The musty smell of neglect wafted down, carrying decades of dust and disuse. My heart hammered against my ribs as I ascended the creaking steps, each one threatening to give way beneath my weight. The attic was exactly as one might expect, low-ceilinged, dimly lit by the gray light filtering through a single round window. Discarded furniture huddled beneath yellowed sheets like forgotten ghosts. Cardboard boxes were stacked in precarious towers, their contents a mystery. But what caught my attention was the far wall, where the roof sloped down to meet the floor. There, partially hidden behind an old wardrobe, was a door, small, like it had been designed for a child, though I immediately pushed that thought away. The door was secured with an ancient padlock, its metal surface pitted with rust. I told myself I should leave, should respect my father's obvious wish to keep this place sealed. But curiosity, that dangerous, insatiable force, pushed me forward. I found a crowbar in a toolbox downstairs and returned to force the lock. It gave way with surprising ease, as if it had been waiting all these years for this moment. Beyond the small door was a space that shouldn't have existed. The dimensions of the house, as I understood them, didn't allow for this room. It was roughly the size of a modest bedroom, with walls of unfinished wood and a floor of bare planks. The air inside was unnaturally cold, raising goosebumps along my arms despite the summer heat outside. The room contained nothing except a standing mirror in the center. The mirror stood 6 feet tall, its ornate frame carved with intricate patterns, vines and leaves intertwined with faces that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. The glass itself was cloudy, as if veiled by smoke, yet it reflected my image with unsettling clarity. As I approached, the temperature dropped further. My breath escaped in visible puffs, and a wave of dizziness washed over me. Standing before the mirror, I noticed details I'd initially missed. The walls of the room were covered in scratches, hundreds, perhaps thousands of them, creating chaotic patterns that radiated outward from the mirror like a sunburst. Some were shallow, barely grazing the surface. Others cut deep into the wood, as if made with desperate force. At the bottom edge of the mirror's frame, dark stains formed the unmistakable outline of handprints, their fingers elongated and thin. My reflection stared back at me, but something was subtly wrong. There was a slight delay in its movements, almost imperceptible unless watched closely. When I raised my hand, my reflection followed a fraction of a second too late. When I blinked, my reflection's eyes remained open just long enough to notice. And when I turned to leave, I could have sworn my reflection remained facing forward, watching me go. That night, the scratching in the walls grew louder. No longer confined to 3 scratch sequences, it became frantic, desperate, the sound of something clawing to escape. I covered my ears with a pillow and forced myself to sleep, telling myself it was just the house settling, just my imagination working overtime after the discovery in the attic. I dreamt of the mirror that night. In my dream, I stood before it again, but instead of my reflection, I saw my father as a young man. He pressed his palms against the glass from the other side, his mouth moving urgently, though no sound came through. Behind him, shadows shifted and swirled, taking half-formed shapes before dissolving again. I tried to read his lips, tried to understand what he was so desperate to communicate, but then the glass began to crack beneath his hands, and I woke up gasping, drenched in cold sweat. The following days developed a routine. I would spend my mornings and afternoons sorting through my father's belongings, preparing the house for eventual sale. But as evening approached, an irresistible compulsion would draw me back to the attic room, back to the mirror. I began to notice changes. The cloudiness of the glass seemed to shift, sometimes clearing to perfect transparency, other times darkening until my reflection was barely visible. The temperature in the room fluctuated wildly. On one visit so cold my fingers turned blue, on the next so warm I broke into a sweat. I found myself speaking to the mirror, asking questions that echoed in the empty room. What are you? What did my father do? Why am I here? The mirror offered no answers, just my own reflection with that unsettling delay, that wrong quality I couldn't quite define. I started experiencing lost time. I would enter the attic room in the early evening and emerge to find it was past midnight, with no memory of the intervening hours. My sleep became fragmented, disrupted by the constant scratching that now followed me throughout the house. It no longer came just from the walls. Now it emanated from beneath floorboards, from inside closets, from behind the shower curtain. During one of my investigations of the house, I discovered a hidden compartment in my father's desk. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with my father's cramped handwriting. Most entries were mundane: daily activities, weather observations, occasional reflections on his solitary life. But scattered throughout were cryptic references to the observer and the thin place upstairs. One passage, dated just 3 months before his death, stood out. It's getting stronger. I can feel it pulling at me even when I'm not in the room. Sometimes I see it from the corner of my eye, not just in the mirror anymore, but in windows, in puddles after rain, in the screen of my television when it's turned off. It wears my face, but it's not me. It has never been me. Did I create it with my loneliness? Or was it always there, waiting for someone isolated enough to notice it? I should destroy the mirror. I know I should. But I fear what might happen if I do. If the barrier is broken, what might come through? My father, I realized, had been fighting something for years, something connected to that mirror. The thought should have sent me running from the house, should have had me calling realtors and movers and putting as much distance as possible between myself and this place. Instead, it deepened my obsession. I began spending all my time in the attic room, sitting cross-legged before the mirror, studying every detail of its frame. every nuance of my delayed reflection. I stopped bothering with the pretense of sorting through my father's belongings. I barely ate, barely slept. The scratching became constant, a backdrop to my waking hours, but I no longer found it disturbing. It had become familiar, almost comforting. One night, I'm not sure which, as the days had begun to blur together, I pressed my palm against the cool surface of the mirror, mirroring the action of my father in my dream. The glass felt strange beneath my touch, not solid as expected, but yielding slightly, like the surface of water resistant to being breached. My reflection did the same, pressing its palm against mine, but its eyes held an eagerness that didn't match my wary curiosity. The scratching stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was so profound, my ears rang with it. And then, slowly, deliberately, my reflection smiled, though I could feel my own face frozen in shock. "He kept me here," my reflection said, its lips moving in perfect sync with words I wasn't speaking. "Your father. He trapped me on this side while he lived free on yours." My throat constricted. I tried to pull my hand away from the glass but found it stuck fast, as if glued in place. The cold from the mirror crept up my arm, numbing it inch by inch. "We could trade places," my reflection suggested, its voice a perfect imitation of mine, yet somehow hollow, like it was speaking from the bottom of a well. "Just for a little while. Don't you want to know what it's like on this side? Don't you want to understand what he was hiding from you all these years?" The offer was tempting in a way I couldn't articulate. Despite every instinct screaming to flee, part of me yearned to step through, to experience whatever reality existed behind the glass. My father had kept this from me, this extraordinary secret, and the childhood resentment of being excluded bubbled up fresh and potent. "It's so easy," my reflection continued, its free hand rising to the surface of the mirror from its side. "Just one step through. I'll show you everything he never wanted you to see." The glass beneath my palm softened further, becoming almost liquid. My hand began to sink into it, the cold sensation traveling up my wrist, my forearm. My reflection's eager smile widened as our fingertips began to pass each other, as we began to exchange places. In that moment, I noticed something at the edges of my vision, the scratches on the walls surrounding the mirror. From this close vantage point, I could see they weren't random after all. They formed words, repeated over and over in my father's handwriting. "Don't trust what you see." With a surge of terror-fueled strength, I wrenched my hand back from the mirror's surface. The vacuum-like suction fought my retreat, but I persisted, throwing my weight backward. My palm came free with a sound like ripping fabric, and I tumbled to the floor, cradling my arm which burned with cold so intense it felt like fire. My reflection remained standing, its expression shifting from eager anticipation to cold fury. It pressed both hands against the glass now, pushing outward with visible strain. The mirror's surface bulged like a membrane, stretching thinner with each push. The frame began to crack, hairline fractures running through the ornate carvings. The temperature in the room plummeted, my breath coming in white clouds before my face. I scrambled backward until my spine hit the scratched wall. The thing in the mirror, no longer trying to maintain the pretense of being my reflection, distorted its features in rage, its fingers elongated, nails extending into claws that scraped against the thinning barrier, adding to the cacophony of scratching that had resumed throughout the house, louder than ever before. Understanding hit me with sudden clarity. The mirror wasn't just a mirror, it was a door, a threshold between worlds. And my father hadn't trapped whatever was in there. He'd been keeping it from getting out. The locked room, the warnings, his isolation, it had all been to contain something that should never be free. I fled the attic room, slamming the small door behind me. Back in the main attic space, I frantically searched through boxes until I found what I needed, an old blanket, thick and heavy. I returned to the mirror room, careful not to look directly at the glass where the thing still pushed and clawed. With my eyes averted, I threw the blanket over the mirror, covering it completely. The effect was immediate. The scratching stopped. The temperature slowly began to normalize. I secured the blanket with rope found elsewhere in the attic, tying it tightly around the frame so no part of the glass remained exposed. Then I retreated, locking the small door behind me and replacing the broken padlock with a new, stronger one I found in my father's toolbox. In the days that followed, I did what my father had done. I researched. His study contained books on folklore, dimensional theory, and esoteric physics. I read accounts of mirrors as portals, of doppelgangers that replace their originals, of spaces that exist between realities. I found notes my father had made about the previous owners of the house, tracking a pattern of disappearances and strange behaviors spanning back a century. I understand now why my father lived as he did, isolated, vigilant, dedicated to a duty he couldn't explain to others. I understand why he left the house to me, his only son, not as a gift, but as an inheritance of responsibility. I won't sell the house. I can't. Instead, I've moved in permanently, establishing my office in the room directly beneath the attic. Sometimes late at night, I still hear faint scratching from above, muted but persistent. A reminder that some barriers require constant maintenance, that some doors must remain not just closed, but guarded. The scratching doesn't frighten me anymore. What terrifies me is the occasional glimpse I catch in ordinary reflective surfaces. Windows, spoons, the screen of my phone when it's turned off. Just for a split second, my reflection smiles before I do, blinks after I do, watches me with patient, hungry eyes. And sometimes in dreams, I see my father on the other side of ordinary mirrors. He no longer tries to speak, no longer presses against the glass. He simply watches me with sad, knowing eyes, warning me, reminding me. Some doors should remain closed. The moment I step into the Blackwood building, something feels wrong. The air hangs differently tonight, heavier, like it's pressing against my skin with deliberate intent. I've worked security here for 3 years, but the building has stood since 1942, its history etched into every creak of the hardwood floors and embedded in the worn brass fixtures. Tonight, that history seems to breathe alongside me. My flashlight beam cuts through the darkness of the lobby, catching dust particles that dance unnaturally in the air. They seem to scatter away from the light rather than float through it. I shake my head. 4 hours into a 12-hour shift, and fatigue is already playing tricks on my mind. The building houses dozens of offices spread across 6 floors, most occupied by law firms and financial advisors who leave behind nothing but expensive furniture and the lingering scent of cologne. My job is simple: make hourly rounds, check that doors remain locked, and ensure nothing disturbs the building's slumber until morning. I begin my 2 a.m. round on the 6th floor, working my way down. My footsteps echo through empty hallways lined with dark mahogany wainscoting and doors bearing gold lettering of company names. The overhead lights remain dimmed overnight, a cost-saving measure that transforms familiar corridors into tunnels of shadow. I check each door, marking them off on my clipboard. The routine is mechanical: grip handle, twist, confirm lock, move on, until I reach room 505. Something stops me. The air feels different here, colder, charged with an expectancy I can't explain. I press my ear to the heavy wooden door and listen. Nothing. I'm about to move on when I hear it. My name, whispered from inside the room. Marcus. So faint I almost doubt I heard it at all. A chill races down my spine, prickling the hairs on my neck. I check the door, locked, as it should be. I verify my clipboard. Hargrove Accounting, vacated at 7:35 p.m. I fumble for my master key, hands suddenly clumsy. The lock clicks, but the door won't budge. Locked from the inside? Impossible. I note the anomaly and continue my rounds, attempting to dismiss the incident as imagination. Yet my heart pounds in my chest, each beat an argument against rationality. 20 minutes later, I've finished the 5th floor and moved to the 4th. But thought of room 505 pulls at me. an insistent itch demanding to be scratched. I decide to check it again before descending further. The corridor seems longer on my return. The emergency exit sign at the far end pulses with an uneven rhythm, casting intermittent red shadows across the walls. As I approach room 505, my flashlight beam catches the door, now standing ajar by several inches. My throat constricts. I know with absolute certainty I'd verified it was locked, inaccessible even with my key. I radio the front desk, asking if any other staff entered the building. The night receptionist's groggy voice confirms I'm the only one on the premises besides him downstairs. I push the door open with my foot, service pistol drawn for the first time in my career. The beam of light jumps across the room, empty desks, filing cabinets, office chairs. Nothing unusual except for a single wooden chair positioned in the center of the room, facing the door, facing me. As if someone had been sitting there, waiting. The room temperature drops 15 degrees compared to the hallway. My exhaled breath forms clouds in the air. I holster my weapon and step inside, checking behind desks and opening the small closet. Nothing. But as I turn to leave, I notice the chair has rotated slightly, now angled toward the door as if tracking my movement. I back out, close the door firmly, and continue my rounds. My rational mind presents explanations. Air currents, an uneven floor, my own disturbance of the room's stillness. Yet none convince the primitive part of my brain screaming that something is wrong. The following nights bring escalating disturbances. On Tuesday, I find 3 doors unlocked that I personally secured hours earlier. Wednesday, the elevator activates itself, traveling between floors with no passengers inside. Thursday, I discover every computer in the 3rd floor law office glowing with active screens, though the power should be disabled after hours. I request the building's maintenance history and employee records, searching for patterns or explanations. The night janitor, Eduardo, has worked here for 20 years. When I casually mention the disturbances, his weathered face pales. He claims to clean only during daylight hours, refusing to elaborate when I press for reasons. Friday night arrives with a thunderstorm that batters the building's windows like impatient fists. I begin my rounds at midnight, earlier than usual, hoping to catch whatever or whoever is responsible. The rain muffles external sounds, leaving only the building's own voice, the settling of old wood, the gurgle of pipes, the hum of emergency lights, as my soundtrack. As I pass the 4th floor water cooler, I notice my reflection in the darkened window beside it. Except it's not quite right. My movements lag by half a second, as if my reflection is deciding whether to follow me. I freeze, and it freezes. I raise my hand, and it raises its hand, but only after a noticeable delay. I lean closer to the glass, studying the anomaly, when my reflection smiles, though my own face remains locked in concentration. I stumble backward, blinking hard. When I look again, the window shows only a normal reflection. But now I feel watched from every angle. From behind closed doors, from air vents, from the very walls themselves. The sensation of eyes crawling across my skin becomes so intense I have to resist the urge to tear at my uniform. I continue my patrol with sweat beading my forehead despite the building's chill. Every shadow seems to stretch toward me. Every reflective surface promises movement just beyond my direct gaze. The building has developed a pulse, its ancient infrastructure now pumping something other than electricity and water through its veins. At 2:13 a.m., the power fails. Emergency lights kick on, bathing the corridors in a dim, amber glow. I call the electric company from my cell phone, learning that despite the storm, no outages have been reported in the area. The building systems have decided to go dark on their own. I make my way to the basement to check the circuit breakers. Each step down the narrow stairwell feels like a descent into something waiting. The basement houses maintenance rooms, storage, and the building's ancient boiler, a mammoth iron contraption that has heated the structure since its construction. The breaker room door stands open, though it should be locked. Inside, in the beam of my flashlight, I find every switch flipped to the off position. No malfunction. Someone or something intentionally killed the power. As I reset them one by one, I hear movement behind me, A shuffling step, the brush of fabric against concrete. I whirl around, light cutting through darkness, heart hammering against my ribs. Nothing. Just the boiler room door across the hall, now standing open when I'm certain it was closed. Steam billows from inside, incongruous since the heating system shouldn't be running in summer. I should call for backup. I should leave. Instead, drawn by the same compulsion that keeps bringing me back to room 505, I approach the boiler room. The door frame radiates heat. Inside, the massive boiler roars at full capacity, its pressure gauge edging toward the red. The room swelters at over 100 degrees, pipes clanking and hissing. Written in the condensation on the boiler's curved metal surface is a name. Marcus. My name, in handwriting I recognize as my own, though I have no memory of writing it. I back away, fumbling for the door, when the boiler's rumble changes pitch, transforming into something like a voice. It speaks words I can't quite comprehend, but their meaning seeps into me nonetheless. A warning or an invitation, I can't tell which. The next week blurs into a nightmare of escalating incidents. I find my patrol logbook filled with entries in my handwriting that I never made. The word beneath appears scrawled on my clipboard, my office computer, my car's fogged window. The security cameras show nothing unusual, except for unexplained gaps in footage precisely during my rounds. Sleep becomes impossible, even at home, miles from the Blackwood building. I wake to sounds of creaking wood and whispers just beyond comprehension. My apartment takes on aspects of the building. Shadows deepen, lights flicker. My bathroom mirror shows that same delayed reflection. I request personnel files from management, learning that 3 previous night guards left within their first month. The longest-serving guard before me, Thomas Miller, quit abruptly after 5 years, leaving behind only a resignation letter with a single line. It knows too much now. By my 4th week of disturbances, I've lost 15 pounds. Dark circles frame my eyes. The building's activities have grown bolder, furniture rearranged into perfect circles overnight, every computer mouse in an office positioned to point at the door, the elevator repeatedly stopping at the 2nd floor, despite no one pressing its buttons. I become obsessed with room 505, returning multiple times each night. Sometimes locked, sometimes open, always empty, yet feeling occupied. The wooden chair appears in different positions each visit. Once, I find it upended, its legs pointing accusingly at the ceiling like a dead insect. I leave a voice recorder running in the room one night. When I retrieve it, the batteries are drained, and it contains 3 hours of silence broken only by a single clear sentence in what sounds like my own voice. You need to see what's underneath. The building's blueprints reveal nothing unusual about room 505 or any other space. But Eduardo, who I've finally convinced to talk, mentions renovations in the 1970s that enclosed an original staircase leading to a sub-basement not shown on current plans. I find the hidden door behind a storage shelf in the main basement. It opens to reveal narrow stone steps descending into darkness. The air rising from below carries the metallic scent of old wiring and something organic, like soil and stagnant water. The stairs end at a flooded chamber, black water covering the floor to ankle depth. My flashlight reveals walls covered in handwritten logs, dates, names, observations spanning decades. Among them, I find entries by Thomas Miller, my predecessor, describing the same phenomena I've experienced. His final entry, dated the day before his resignation, reads only, "It's not the building that's haunted." In the center of the room stands a wooden chair identical to the one in room 505, half submerged in the dark water. As I approach, the surface ripples, not from my movement, but from something stirring below. The water begins to drain through some unseen outlet, revealing the chair's legs, then the floor beneath. Carved into the concrete is a perfect map of the building, each room meticulously labeled. Small X marks indicate specific locations: the elevator, the boiler room, room 505, and others where I've experienced phenomena. I kneel to examine the map, my fingers tracing the outline of the building. The water continues to recede, revealing words carved around the perimeter. The building is not haunted. The guard is haunted. Cold realization washes over me. The phenomena appeared after I arrived, not before. They follow me home. The building isn't haunted. I am. Or rather, the position I occupy is. Something ancient has attached itself not to the structure, but to the role of its nighttime sentinel. As this understanding crystallizes, the atmosphere shifts. The oppressive weight that has followed me for weeks suddenly lifts. The room brightens, though my flashlight remains dim. I feel acknowledged, as if passing some test of comprehension. I return to room 505 one last time. The chair now faces the window instead of the door. On its seat lies my resignation letter, already completed in my handwriting, awaiting only my signature. Beside it rests a personnel file for the next guard who will take my place, who will inherit not just my duties, but my haunting. I have a choice. I can sign, walk away, pass this burden to someone else. Or I can stay, understand it, perhaps even master it. The building and I regard each other in new comprehension. The lights flicker once, twice, then stabilize, brighter than before. I tear up the resignation letter. The chair rotates slightly toward me, as if in approval. The night shift continues, but now on different terms. I am no longer an intruder in the building's slumber, but its chosen companion. The whispers continue, but now I'm beginning to understand what they're saying. And sometimes when I pass the windows on my rounds, my reflection waves at me, just a moment before I raise my own hand. The shadows in this building don't behave like normal shadows. They stretch when they shouldn't, retreat when approached, and sometimes, just sometimes, I swear they whisper my name. My apartment sits on the 7th floor of the Blackwood, a pre-war structure nestled between modern high-rises in downtown Chester. The contrast makes the building look even more ancient, a weathered face among smooth-skinned youths. I've lived here for 11 months now, and for 9 of them, I've been convinced I'm not alone. The first incident happened on a Tuesday. I remember because I had stayed late debugging code at the office, and by the time I dragged myself home, the midnight hour had come and gone. The elevator, a rattling brass cage that wheezed more than it moved, deposited me on my floor with its usual mechanical sigh. The hallway stretched before me, illuminated by sickly yellow bulbs that created more shadows than light. The carpet, once red, now a mottled burgundy brown, absorbed my footsteps as I walked toward apartment 713. That's when I felt it, a prickle at the nape of my neck, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. I turned, expecting to see Mrs. Ogilvy from 709 peering through her peephole as she often did. The hallway was empty, yet the feeling persisted, a weight pressing against my consciousness, as tangible as fingers tracing my spine. I dismissed it as fatigue, a byproduct of 70-hour work weeks and too much caffeine. But over the following weeks, the sensation intensified. Each night, the hallway seemed to stretch a little longer, the shadows growing a little darker, the silence a little more expectant. I began to dread coming home. 1 month after that first night, I heard my name. Daniel. The word floated down the corridor, barely above a whisper, originating from somewhere near the abandoned wing, a section of the building damaged by water years ago and awaiting repairs that never came. I froze, keys suspended before my lock, heart suddenly hammering against my ribs. "Hello," I called, immediately regretting it. My voice sounded thin, vulnerable. No response came, but the air seemed to thicken, pressing against my eardrums. I hurried inside my apartment, locked the door, and spent the night with all the lights on, telling myself I'd imagined it. I hadn't. The next night it came again, more distinct. "Daniel, help me." The voice was neither male nor female, neither young nor old. It existed in some unsettling in-between space. I tried to rationalize it, perhaps sound traveling through the old ventilation system, or a neighbor playing some elaborate prank. I mentioned it casually to the building superintendent, a perpetually damp man named Horvath. His reaction told me everything I needed to know. His already pallid face blanched further, and he mumbled something about old buildings having quirks, before quickly changing the subject. When I pressed him about the abandoned wing, he became evasive, suggesting that perhaps I should consider moving when my lease ended. That night, I researched the Blackwood's history. Most sources mentioned its architectural significance or its famous residents from the 1920s, but one obscure blog detailed darker events. 27 years ago, a resident had disappeared without a trace. The blog speculated about foul play, but offered no concrete details. Comments below the post had been disabled. I dug deeper, requesting old newspaper archives from the library. What I found disturbed me more than the whispers. The missing resident, one Edward Marcello, had lived in apartment 724, located in what was now the abandoned wing. Police had investigated but found nothing suspicious. The case had eventually gone cold. What the blog hadn't mentioned was that in the weeks before his disappearance, Marcello had complained to neighbors about hearing voices in the hallway. Sleep became a luxury I could no longer afford. Every creak of the building, every distant footstep, every whisper of wind through the poorly sealed windows had me bolt upright, straining to listen. The voice continued, becoming a nightly occurrence, always emanating from the sealed-off corridor, always calling my name, always pleading for help. My work suffered. I began making careless errors, missing deadlines. My supervisor suggested I take some personal days. Instead of resting, I spent the time researching the building's history and Edward Marcello's life. I learned he had been an architect, involved in renovating several historic buildings around the city. He had lived alone, had no close family, few friends, like me. The parallels unsettled me. 3 months after the first whisper, I broke. Not in the way you might expect. Not with screams or tears or a frantic call to the police. No, my breaking was quieter, more deliberate. I decided to follow the voice. The next time I heard it, "Daniel, I need you." I walked toward it instead of away from it. The hallway seemed to stretch before me, the distance to the abandoned wing expanding with each step. The yellow lights flickered as I passed beneath them, and the air grew colder the further I ventured from my apartment. A chain with a no-entry sign blocked the entrance to the damaged wing. I stepped over it without hesitation. This section of the hallway was darker, the carpet removed to reveal warped floorboards. The walls showed water damage, paint peeling in long strips that resembled flayed skin. The voice grew stronger. "Daniel, closer." My heart pounded so violently I could feel my shirt moving with each beat. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the chill. My mouth had gone desert dry. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, yet I continued forward, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't explain. The numbers on the doors had faded, but I could still make out 724, Marcello's apartment. The door stood slightly ajar, revealing only darkness beyond. The voice emanated from within, now a continuous, urgent whisper. "Daniel, Daniel, Daniel." I pushed the door open. The hinges protested with a sound like a wounded animal. The apartment was empty, not just of furniture, but somehow empty of space itself. Despite the windows, no light penetrated the gloom. I felt dizzy, disoriented, as if the room existed in some dimension adjacent to, but not quite part of our reality. "Who are you?" I managed to ask, my voice barely functioning. The temperature plummeted. My breath emerged in white clouds. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to deepen, to move with purpose. And then, from everywhere and nowhere, the voice responded. No longer a whisper, but a chorus of whispers layered upon one another. They explained that the building existed at a crossroads of sorts, not just physical space, but something more ephemeral. Marcello had discovered this while renovating, had found that certain configurations of architecture could create doorways. He had become obsessed, modifying his apartment, attempting to communicate with whatever existed on the other side. He had succeeded too well. What came through couldn't fully exist in our world, but neither could it return. It remained trapped between states. gradually extending its influence throughout the building. It had called to Marcello, as it now called to me. I asked what had happened to him. The whispers paused, then admitted they had no concept of what humans called time. Marcello might have left, might have stayed, might still be trying to find his way back. They couldn't say. They only knew that they were still trapped, and that I could help them. My legs trembled beneath me. How? I asked, though part of me already knew. The shadows writhed and contracted. The whispers suggested modifications to my apartment, slight adjustments to angles, removal of certain barriers, specific marks to be made on walls and floors. Nothing drastic, nothing that would alert the superintendent. Small changes that would help them extend their influence, help them reach others, help them become more. I stumbled backward toward the door. The shadows surged forward, not aggressively, but eagerly. The whispers rose in volume and urgency, explaining how I wouldn't be harmed, how I would be rewarded, how I would understand truths no other human could comprehend. I fled. Back in my apartment, I barricaded the door with furniture. I stuffed towels under the door and taped the windows. I turned on every light, every electronic device that emitted noise, television, radio, laptop, creating a barrage of sound to drown out any whispers that might penetrate my defenses. It didn't help. That night, the voice found me in my dreams. It showed me visions of what it promised, knowledge beyond human understanding, perception beyond the limited 5 senses we possess. It showed me what Marcello had seen, the patterns hidden in reality that, once recognized, could never be unseen. I woke drenched in sweat, my throat raw as if I'd been screaming. On my bedside table lay a sheet of paper covered in drawings, angles, measurements, strange symbols. My own handwriting, but I had no memory of creating it. A blueprint for the modifications the whispers had requested. The following week passed in a fugue state. By day, I researched options for breaking my lease. By night, I fought the compulsion to begin the modifications. The whispers grew more persuasive, more reasonable. They explained that they weren't malevolent, merely different. They needed help to understand our world, to find their way back to theirs. Was that so wrong? Wasn't I curious? Wouldn't anyone be? I found myself making small marks on the walls without realizing it, moving furniture slightly out of alignment, measuring angles between corners of my apartment. Each small action brought a surge of whispers, approving, encouraging. My salvation came unexpectedly. While researching the building's history at the city library, I discovered an architectural journal containing an interview with Edward Marcello from shortly before his disappearance. In it, he discussed his fascination with non-Euclidean geometry and its application in creating spaces that challenge human perception. The interviewer had noted Marcello's excitement about his personal project, modifications to his apartment in the Blackwood. But one detail stopped me cold. Marcello had mentioned hearing whispers that guided his work, that promised him knowledge. He had been thrilled, believing he was on the verge of a breakthrough. The interviewer had written it off as artistic eccentricity. The pattern became clear. Whatever existed beyond that doorway needed human assistance to widen it. It had used Marcello. Now it was using me, and if I succeeded where Marcello had perhaps failed, it would find someone else after me, continuing to expand its influence. That night, I confronted the whispers. I told them I knew what they were doing, that I wouldn't help them. The shadows in my apartment contracted violently. The whispers became harsher, no longer pleading but demanding. The temperature dropped until I could see my breath. Objects shifted on shelves. My television turned itself on and off. My phone rang with no caller. I endured it all, repeating a simple mantra: I will not help you. By morning, the psychic assault had subsided to a sullen presence. The whispers continued, but with less force. I packed essential belongings and checked into a hotel, then began searching for a new apartment. I told Horvath I was breaking my lease due to personal reasons. The look of relief on his face confirmed he knew more than he had admitted about the building's secrets. 2 weeks later, I moved to a modern high-rise across town. For the first few nights, I still heard faint whispers at the edge of sleep, still felt watched in empty rooms. But gradually, the sensations faded. I still research the Blackwood when I can't sleep. I've found records of other residents over the years who left suddenly, who complained of strange occurrences, who seemed to change during their time there. I wonder how many heard the whispers, how many helped widen that doorway, even slightly. Sometimes I worry about my successor in apartment 713. I've considered warning them, but what would I say? That the building whispers, that shadows move with purpose, that something ancient and patient waits behind the walls? They wouldn't believe me. I wouldn't have believed me. And sometimes, on nights when my new apartment seems too quiet, too normal, too limited by the physics I've always known, I find myself drawing angles and symbols on scrap paper. I find myself missing the whispers and their promises of perception beyond human understanding. Those are the nights I destroy the drawings, delete my research, and remind myself of Edward Marcello, the architect who heard whispers and was never seen again. Because as terrifying as those whispers were, more terrifying still is the part of me that sometimes wishes I had listened. The first time I noticed something wrong with my shadow was on a Tuesday in late October. I remember because the streetlights had just flickered on as I walked the final block to my apartment, casting an elongated silhouette across the pavement before me. Something about its proportions felt off. My head appeared too large, my shoulders too narrow, my fingers too long. But fatigue clouds perception, and after 14 hours at the office, I dismissed it as just another symptom of exhaustion. I was wrong. Every night that week, I found myself staring at my shadow, an uncomfortable sensation crawling up my spine. The distortions were subtle at first, barely perceptible shifts in proportion that I could almost convince myself were imagined. But by Friday, the differences had become impossible to ignore. As I stood beneath the same streetlight, my shadow stretched nearly twice as far as it should have, its edges rippling slightly despite the complete absence of wind. I rationalized it away, a trick of the light, an optical illusion, perhaps even a manifestation of stress. My job at the architectural firm had become increasingly demanding, with the Peterson project consuming my every waking hour. Sleep deprivation does strange things to perception. At least, that's what I told myself. Until the night I saw it move. I was fumbling with my keys at the entrance to my apartment building when movement caught my eye. My shadow, cast against the brick wall by the security light above, lifted its arm while mine remained firmly at my side, keys dangling from rigid fingers. The movement was swift, almost imperceptible, like watching something dart past your peripheral vision. But there was no mistaking what I'd seen. My heart hammered against my ribcage, a cold sweat breaking across my forehead despite the autumn chill. I dropped my keys, the metallic clatter echoing in the empty street. When I looked back at the wall, my shadow had returned to normal, mirroring my hunched posture as I bent to retrieve them. That night, I slept with every light in my apartment blazing. The following morning, daylight brought clarity and doubt. The human mind has a remarkable capacity for self-deception, especially when confronted with the impossible. I convinced myself I had imagined the whole incident, a hallucination born from stress and caffeine abuse. I even laughed about it as I showered, water cascading over my closed eyelids. But when I opened them and saw a dark figure through the frosted glass that didn't match my movements, the laughter died in my throat. I yanked the shower curtain back so violently that I tore one of the rings, my wet feet slipping on the tile as I stumbled backward. There was nothing there, of course, just steam and the harsh glare of bathroom lights. But the damage was done. The seed of doubt had taken root. I began to document the discrepancies. Each night after work, I would stand in various lighting conditions and photograph my shadow with my phone. At home, I would compare the images, looking for inconsistencies. The evidence was undeniable. Day by day, the silhouette grew less and less like my own, its proportions elongating, its edges becoming jagged where mine were smooth. I stopped telling colleagues I'd stay late to finish projects. Instead, I began leaving work while the sun was still high, eliminating shadows altogether. I took different routes home, avoiding streetlights when possible. When forced to walk through illuminated areas, I moved quickly, refusing to look down or at the walls where my distorted double might be projected. But avoidance is a temporary solution at best. As November deepened toward winter, the days grew shorter. Darkness fell by 5, and my options dwindled. The first time I saw the eye was on a night when sleet fell in sheets of freezing rain. I was hurrying up the steps to my building, collar turned up against the biting wind, when a flash of lightning illuminated the courtyard. For a split second, my shadow stretched across the concrete, and in the center of its featureless head gleamed a single luminous eye. The sleet soaked through my coat as I stood frozen, staring at the ground where only a normal shadow now lay. But I had seen it, golden yellow with a vertical pupil, like a cat's eye caught in headlights. It had been looking directly at me. I called in sick the next day, drawing the blinds and huddling in darkness. When the superintendent knocked to check on me, apparently concerned by the sounds of furniture being moved against walls, I barely cracked the door, explaining hoarsely that I had the flu. He seemed skeptical, but left me alone. I didn't tell him I'd been barricading myself in, covering every reflective surface, every source of potential shadows. The isolation only heightened my awareness. In the artificial darkness of my apartment, I began to notice things. The way the shadow beneath my door seemed to pulse, like the slow breathing of something lying in wait. How the darkness in the corners of rooms appeared deeper than it should be, as if extending beyond the physical constraints of the walls. The whisper of movement just beyond my peripheral vision that ceased the moment I turned my head. Sleep became a distant memory. When exhaustion finally claimed me, I would jerk awake moments later, convinced that something was standing over my bed. The darkness around me felt heavy, pregnant with malevolent attention. Each night, I swore I could hear breathing that didn't match my own. Soft, measured, and patient. After 3 days of this self-imposed quarantine, reality began to blur at the edges. I needed to get out, to walk in daylight, to remind myself of a world where shadows were just absences of light and nothing more. I waited until noon, when the sun would be at its highest and shadows at their smallest, then ventured outside. The world seemed unnaturally bright after days in darkness. I walked through the park near my apartment, savoring the normality of joggers and dog walkers, the mundane sounds of traffic and conversation. For a while, I felt almost sane, almost safe. Then I passed a group of children playing near the fountain, and noticed that while each child cast a shadow, mine was inexplicably absent. The pavement beneath me remained empty of any silhouette, as if light passed through me unhindered. A wave of vertigo sent me staggering to a nearby bench. Checking my phone camera confirmed what my eyes were telling me. No shadow. I had been so afraid of what my shadow was becoming that its complete absence struck me as an even greater horror. Where had it gone? What was it doing, freed from the constraints of my movements? I felt naked, exposed, as if I'd lost some essential part of myself. Passers-by gave me a wide berth as I sat trembling on the bench, sweat beading on my forehead despite the chill. I heard someone ask if I was okay, but their voice seemed to come from underwater, distorted and far away. I don't remember walking home. One moment I was in the park, and the next I was standing before my apartment door, key in hand. The hallway was dimly lit, as always, a perpetual twilight maintained by energy-saving bulbs that never quite dispelled the gloom. As I turned the key, I glanced down automatically. My shadow had returned, but it wasn't alone. Superimposed over my own silhouette was another, its edges bleeding into mine like ink diffusing through water. Where our forms overlapped, the darkness deepened to an impossible black that seemed to devour light. As I watched, paralyzed, the second shadow began to pull away from mine, separating like a cell dividing. I fumbled with the door, desperation making me clumsy. Behind me, I heard a sound like fabric tearing, the unmistakable noise of something crossing a threshold it was never meant to cross. The air grew heavy, pressing against my eardrums until they ached. The temperature plummeted so rapidly that my next exhale crystallized before my eyes. The door finally swung open, and I threw myself inside, slamming it shut behind me. My apartment was dark, darker than it should have been in mid-afternoon. The blinds I'd left open were now drawn, plunging the rooms into shadow. I reached for the light switch with shaking fingers. Nothing happened. The darkness remained absolute, as if the electricity had been cut. But the microwave clock still glowed from the kitchen, its green digits floating disembodied in the blackness. The darkness was selective, consuming only the lights I needed most. I fumbled for my phone, activating its flashlight. The beam cut through the gloom, revealing furniture draped in shadows that seemed too solid, too textured to be mere absences of light. They clung to surfaces like black moss, thicker in the corners where walls met ceiling. That's when I noticed the wall opposite me. My flashlight beam revealed my shadow, cast in sharp relief against the white paint. But it wasn't mimicking my posture. While I stood frozen in the entryway, arm extended with my phone, the silhouette on the wall was turned to face me, its head cocked at an impossible angle. In the center of its featureless face, that same golden eye blinked open. I ran, through the apartment, slipping on shadows that felt slick underfoot, like oil spreading across the hardwood, into my bedroom where I slammed the door and wedged a chair beneath the handle. The flashlight beam weakened, dimming despite the battery being at full charge. In its fading light, I saw shadows gathering beneath the door, seeping in like smoke. With the last of the light, I spotted my laptop on the nightstand. I lunged for it, flipping it open. The screen illuminated, pushing back the encroaching darkness. My fingers flew across the keyboard, searching for answers, explanations, anything that might help me understand what was happening. What I found was worse than ignorance. Accounts spanning centuries and cultures described it. The Umbra Parasitus, the shadow thief, the dark passenger, an entity that latches onto a host through their shadow, gradually assuming control. It begins with subtle distortions, progresses to independent movement, and culminates in complete separation, at which point the entity has gathered enough substance to exist independently. And then it feeds. Not on blood or flesh, but on light, on life itself. It drains its host slowly, leaving them an empty shell devoid of vitality. The victims don't die. They simply fade, becoming living shadows, barely noticed by those around them. They continue their routines like automated puppets, working jobs, paying bills, speaking when spoken to, but their eyes remain vacant, their movements mechanical. The laptop screen flickered, dimming as if being drained. I slammed it shut, plunging the room back into darkness. For a moment, complete silence enveloped me. Then came the sound of something wet moving across the floor, a viscous slithering that made my skin crawl. My phone vibrated in my pocket. With trembling hands, I withdrew it, the screen casting a feeble glow. A text message from an unknown number. Look in the mirror. Ice flooded my veins as I raised my eyes to the closet mirror across the room. In its reflection, I could see myself illuminated by the phone's light, and behind me, a figure composed entirely of darkness, its edges rippling like disturbed water. The golden eye floated in its approximation of a head, fixing me with a gaze that felt ancient and patient. My body responded before my mind could process what was happening. I hurled the phone at the mirror, shattering both. Glass rained down, the phone's light extinguished as it cracked against the wall. Darkness swallowed me completely. What followed was a night of absolute terror. I huddled on my bed, listening to something move around my room, occasionally feeling cold air brush against my skin as it passed. Once, I felt what might have been fingers, long, cold, and insubstantial, trace the line of my jaw. I screamed then, a primal sound torn from the deepest part of me. In response, I heard laughter, my own voice, but distorted, as if heard underwater. Dawn finally came, gray light seeping reluctantly through the blinds. The shadows receded to their natural places, though they seemed darker, more defined than normal shadows should be. I didn't wait to see what would happen when night returned. I packed a bag and fled my apartment, driving without destination. I've been moving ever since, staying in brightly lit hotels, sleeping with every light blazing. I avoid going out after dark. I stay away from places with dim lighting. When forced to walk through shadow, I move quickly, never looking down. But I know it's still with me. Sometimes, in bright fluorescent light, I catch glimpses of my shadow behaving as it should. And other times, I have no shadow at all. In those moments of absence, I feel its attention on me, patient and hungry. Last night, I woke to find my hotel room cast in deeper darkness than it should have been, despite the lights I'd left on. In the bathroom, water ran from a tap I was certain I'd turned off. When I approached the partially open door, I saw my shadow stretched across the tile floor, but I stood frozen in the bedroom doorway. In the mirror above the sink, illuminated by a single functioning light, I caught a glimpse of myself. For a moment, my reflection looked normal. Then it smiled with teeth too sharp and numerous to be human, and a single golden eye opened in the center of its forehead. I'm writing this now from a 24-hour diner, surrounded by light and people, but daylight is fading. Soon I'll need to find somewhere to stay, somewhere bright. I don't know how much longer I can run, or if there's anywhere I can hide from something that lives in the darkness I inevitably cast. Because the truth is, we all create shadows. We all provide doorways. And mine isn't just following me anymore. It's becoming me. The first night in the Caldwell house, I woke at precisely 3:17 a.m. to the sound of something dragging itself across the ceiling above my bed. Not the scurrying of rodents or the familiar settling of an old house, but something deliberate, something with weight and purpose. I lay paralyzed, my breath caught in my throat, as the scraping moved from one end of the ceiling to the other, paused directly above me, and then stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise. I didn't sleep again until dawn broke through the curtains, casting long, accusatory shadows across my new bedroom. I hadn't wanted this house. Uncle Edwin was barely a name mentioned at family gatherings, a reclusive figure who'd withdrawn from the family decades before I was born. When the lawyer contacted me about the inheritance, I'd been surprised, not just at being named the sole beneficiary, but that I'd been chosen over closer relatives. The property was located in a small New England town I'd never visited, 3 hours from Boston, where I'd been struggling to make rent after losing my job as an architectural draftsman. The timing seemed fortuitous, almost as if Uncle Edwin had known I would need a fresh start. The house stood isolated at the end of a winding gravel drive, surrounded by ancient oaks whose branches scraped against the windows during storms. It was a Victorian monstrosity of gables and turrets, its facade weathered by decades of neglect. The locals in town avoided eye contact when I mentioned my inheritance, changing the subject or suddenly remembering urgent errands. Only Mrs. Harmon at the general store offered anything resembling information, informing me in hushed tones that my uncle hadn't been seen in town for nearly 7 years before his death. The county coroner had been called when the mail carrier noticed an unusual smell coming from the house. She didn't elaborate further, and I didn't press. During my initial walkthrough, I'd been struck by how the interior seemed frozen in time. Heavy furniture draped in sheets, wallpaper curling at the seams, a thick layer of dust on every surface except, strangely, the staircase. The real estate agent who handed over the keys had pointed out various features with mechanical efficiency, never stepping fully into any room. When we reached the second-floor landing, I noticed a narrow door at the end of the hallway with a peculiar brass lock. "What's up there?" I asked. The agent's smile tightened. "The attic. Unfortunately, the key has been missing for years." He quickly directed my attention to the master bedroom, speaking more rapidly than before. When I inquired about the attic again as he was leaving, he simply shrugged and suggested I contact a locksmith if I was determined to get in. His parting words, that some spaces are kept locked for a reason, seemed unnecessarily cryptic at the time. Now, lying awake at 4 a.m. on my third night in the house, they felt prophetic. The strange noises continued each night, growing more distinct. By the fifth night, I could differentiate between the dragging sound and what seemed like fingernails gently scratching at the wooden beams. Sometimes I thought I heard a soft, rhythmic tapping, almost like Morse code. I told myself it was the house settling, or perhaps branches against the roof. But these rational explanations dissolved when I heard what sounded unmistakably like footsteps pacing back and forth directly above my bedroom. During daylight hours, I tried to find information about the house or my uncle. The local historical society had little beyond construction dates and a mention that the property had once belonged to a ship captain who'd made his fortune in the China trade. The town records offered nothing unusual about Edwin Caldwell. He'd purchased the house in 1984, paid his taxes on time, and had no police incidents on record. The library's newspaper archives showed he'd been briefly mentioned in a 1998 article about local recluses, described only as intensely private and scholarly. On my seventh day in the house, I decided to tackle the attic. I'd searched every drawer and cabinet for the missing key without success. Mrs. Peterson, the cleaning woman who'd reluctantly agreed to help me sort through decades of dust and neglect, refused to even look at the attic door. When I asked why, she muttered something about bad air up there and promptly left for the day, not returning for our scheduled cleaning the following week. I purchased a pry bar and hammer from the hardware store. The elderly owner asked no questions but studied my face with undisguised concern. That night, after steeling myself with a glass of whiskey, I approached the attic door. The lock was ornate brass, antique but sturdy. I placed the pry bar against the door frame and applied pressure. The wood groaned in protest. With each strike of the hammer, I felt the temperature in the hallway drop several degrees. When the lock finally gave way with a sound like a wounded animal, a rush of stale, fetid air escaped from the darkness beyond. The beam of my flashlight revealed a steep staircase leading up into shadows. The air smelled of mildew and something else, a sweet, rotten odor that made my stomach clench. At the top of the stairs, I found a single large room with a sharply angled ceiling. Empty. No furniture, no storage boxes, no signs of habitation. Just bare wooden floorboards and exposed roof beams. The only window was a small circular opening at the far end, its glass so caked with grime that barely any moonlight filtered through. As I moved further into the room, the flashlight beam caught something on the floor. Dark stains in a pattern that didn't appear random. They spread outward from the center of the room like tendrils or branches, each ending abruptly as if something had been dragged through ink and then lifted. I knelt to examine one of the marks and found the wood there slightly sunken, as if damaged by moisture or acid. The stain wasn't dust or dirt, but seemed embedded in the grain of the wood itself. A sudden noise from downstairs, like a door slowly opening, broke my examination. I froze, listening intently. The house had been silent except for my own movements. But now I distinctly heard the sound of the front door closing, followed by footsteps in the entry hall. I called out, asking if Mrs. Peterson had returned, though I knew she wouldn't come to the house after dark. No response came, but the footsteps stopped. I hurriedly made my way down the attic stairs, my heart hammering against my ribs. The hallway was empty. So was the entry hall when I descended the main staircase, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The front door remained locked, deadbolt secured, just as I had left it. I searched each room on the ground floor, finding nothing out of place until I reached the kitchen. There, on the floor, was a trail of what looked like dark, viscous liquid, leading from the back door to the cellar entrance. It glistened in the flashlight beam, still wet. I didn't investigate further that night. Instead, I retreated to my bedroom, wedging a chair under the doorknob and keeping the lights on until morning. Sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by what sounded like soft footsteps in the hallway outside my door, and at one point, the distinct sensation of the mattress depressing as if someone had sat on the edge of my bed. When I jerked upright, heart racing, nothing was there, but the air held that same sweet putrid smell I'd encountered in the attic. The following morning revealed no trace of the liquid trail I'd seen in the kitchen. I might have convinced myself I'd imagined it if not for the strange, tacky residue that remained on the hardwood floor. When I touched it, My finger came away with a colorless, odorless substance that stretched like honey before breaking. I scrubbed at it with bleach, but it seemed to seep deeper into the wood rather than cleaning away. That day, I drove into town and casually asked the barber about my uncle while getting a haircut. The old man's scissors paused momentarily before he continued, commenting that Edwin had been a brilliant man, a chemist who'd worked for a pharmaceutical company before his retirement. When I pressed for more information, mentioning the attic specifically, the barber's hand trembled slightly. He suggested that some hobbies are best pursued in isolation, especially those involving unstable elements. Before I could ask what he meant, another customer entered, and the barber abruptly changed the subject. The town librarian proved more forthcoming when I inquired about any scientific research my uncle might have published. She directed me to several obscure chemistry journals from the early 2000s, where I found articles authored by Edwin Caldwell on experimental compounds derived from rare fungi. His later papers explored theoretical applications for what he termed semi-organic polymers with unique adhesive properties. The final publication, dated 2015, contained references to achieving partial autonomous movement in non-sentient organic compounds. The accompanying photographs showed Petri dishes containing black viscous substances formed into patterns disturbingly similar to the stains I'd found in the attic. That night, the noises changed. Instead of coming from above, they seemed to emanate from every corner of the house, from inside the walls, beneath the floorboards, behind the bookcases. I sat rigid in the living room, watching shadows shift at the periphery of my vision. Around midnight, the electricity flickered and died, plunging the house into darkness. In the beam of my emergency flashlight, I saw distinct handprints on the living room wall, too large to be human, with elongated fingers that left glistening trails down to the baseboard. I retreated to my car and spent the night at a motel in town. The desk clerk said nothing about my disheveled appearance or the late hour, simply sliding me a room key with a knowing glance. In the harsh fluorescent lighting of the motel bathroom, I noticed dark smudges on the back of my neck, fingerprint-shaped marks that hadn't been there before. When I touched them, my skin felt numb and slightly puckered, as if mildly burned. Logic dictated that I should leave, sell the house, forget the inheritance, return to Boston. But something held me there. Perhaps it was financial necessity, or maybe a deeper need to understand what my uncle had been doing in that house. What had he created in that attic? And why had he left the house to me, specifically? I returned the next day armed with research. At the university library 2 towns over, I'd found more detailed records of Edwin's work, including rejected grant proposals for experiments combining mycology and organic chemistry to create responsive biomaterials. One document mentioned a promising breakthrough using spores from a rare fungus found only in caves, combined with synthetic compounds to create a substance that responded to electrical stimuli. The university had deemed the research ethically problematic and denied further funding. That night, I waited in the living room with my uncle's journal spread before me, a shotgun across my lap. I'd found the books hidden in a compartment beneath the floorboards in his study, their pages filled with increasingly erratic handwriting, detailing experiments conducted in the attic. The latest entries described success in creating a symbiotic entity that required human bioelectrical fields to maintain cohesion. Edwin had written about feeding the creation with his own bioelectricity, allowing it to touch him for brief periods while it was still developing. The final entry, dated just weeks before his estimated time of death, contained a single sentence. It grows stronger each night, learning the shape of me. As midnight approached, the temperature in the house plummeted. My breath fogged in the air as the first sounds began. Not from the attic this time, but from the cellar. Something was climbing the stairs, its movements more confident than before. I raised the shotgun as the cellar door creaked open. What emerged wasn't what I'd expected. Not a monster or creature in any traditional sense, but something more like a liquid shadow that retained a vaguely humanoid shape. It moved with increasing steadiness, leaving glistening trails on the floor. In the center of its mass, I could make out darker nodules pulsing like multiple hearts. It paused at the threshold, seeming to study me. I felt a strange electrical sensation on my skin, as if the air between us was charged with static. I recognized then what my uncle had created, and what had ultimately consumed him. He hadn't died naturally. He had been absorbed, his consciousness and electrical patterns integrated into the entity he'd cultivated. And now it was reaching out with appendages that grew more defined each second, shaped by memories of human form but improved upon. Longer, stronger, more adaptable. I understood in that moment why the house had been left to me. Family DNA, compatible bioelectrical patterns, a new host for a creation that had outgrown its maker. I didn't fire the shotgun. Instead, I backed slowly toward the front door, maintaining eye contact with the shifting mass that had once, in part, been my uncle. It followed at a measured pace, leaving intricate patterns of residue that formed complex mathematical equations on my hardwood floor. I still live in the house at the end of the winding drive. The entity and I have reached an understanding of sorts. It remains in the attic during daylight hours, feeding on the specialized compounds I mix according to my uncle's formulas. At night it roams the house, growing more defined, more intelligent with each passing week. Sometimes it leaves complex molecular diagrams on my bedroom walls, gifts or communications I'm still learning to interpret. The locals avoid me now, just as they avoided Edwin. They've noticed the changes in my appearance, the slight gloss to my skin, the darker pigmentation spreading from my fingertips up my arms. Mrs. Peterson quit after finding me speaking to an empty room, not realizing I was conversing with something she couldn't yet perceive. I've begun my own journal, documenting the entity's evolution and my gradual transformation. My uncle's research was incomplete. He didn't understand that the relationship could be symbiotic rather than parasitic if properly managed. I'm improving the formula, finding ways for us to coexist more harmoniously. Each night, I leave the attic door open. Each night I feel less fear and more curiosity as I wait to see what new shape emerges from the darkness at the top of the stairs. Each night, we become a little less separate, a little more unified in purpose. And each morning, as I wash away the residue it leaves on my skin, I notice how much more quickly I heal, how much sharper my senses have become, how the world seems brighter and more vivid than before. I've stopped questioning my sanity. Sanity is such a limited concept when one stands at the threshold of becoming something entirely new. The attic is no longer empty. Neither am I. The scratching came back last night. It always starts faint, almost imperceptible, like fingernails barely grazing the surface of old wood. Then it grows insistent, deliberate. Scratch, 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 a rhythm that matches my heartbeat as I lie awake, staring at the ceiling of my apartment, 12 miles and a lifetime away from that damned archive room. I haven't returned in 3 weeks, but the sound follows me home. Sometimes I smell it too, that distinctive blend of mildew, dust, and something else, something older and more primal than the building itself. I never believed in hauntings before the Harrington building. The restoration project had seemed like the perfect opportunity to give back to my community while indulging my passion for historical architecture. The Harrington, a massive limestone structure built in 1897, had served various civic functions over the decades: courthouse, municipal offices, public records repository, before falling into disrepair in the 1990s. Our volunteer group, mostly retirees and weekend warriors like myself, had been working for months to restore it to something resembling its former glory. My professional background in library sciences made me the natural choice to tackle the second-floor archive room. The space was imposing: 20-foot ceilings, walls lined with empty wooden shelves, and tall windows that filtered the sunlight through decades of grime. The original documentation had long since been relocated to the new city hall, but boxes of forgotten papers remained, waiting to be sorted and cataloged before any restoration work could begin. Most volunteers avoided the archive. They claimed it was the dust or the tedium of sorting paperwork, but I sensed something else in their reluctance. Mrs. Abernathy, our 80-year-old local history enthusiast, had once mentioned in passing that the last archivist who worked in the building had gone peculiar before retirement. When I pressed for details, she changed the subject with practiced efficiency. The incident happened on my 5th Saturday at the Harrington, late October, with that particular quality of autumn light that seems to carry its own melancholy. I had volunteered to stay late, wanting to finish categorizing a particularly interesting collection of property disputes from the 1920s. The building emptied around 4 p.m., with Paolo, our project manager, reminding me to lock up when I finished. The Harrington takes on a different personality when empty. Footsteps echo differently. Shadows deepen in corners. The building creaks and settles like an old man getting comfortable in his favorite chair. I'd grown accustomed to these sounds over the weeks, even finding comfort in their predictable unpredictability. The archive room's door was solid oak, weathered but sturdy, with an old-fashioned brass handle and no visible lock mechanism. It had a tendency to stick in the frame, a problem on our maintenance list, so I'd propped it open with a doorstop while I worked at the large table in the center of the room, surrounded by stacks of yellowing papers. I remember checking my watch. 5:47 p.m. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the room. I had just discovered a particularly fascinating boundary dispute involving what is now the city park when the first anomaly occurred. The temperature in the room dropped precipitously. Not the gradual cooling of evening, but a sudden plunge that sent goosebumps racing across my forearms and turned my breath visible in the air. Before I could process this, the door slammed shut with such force that dust rained down from the ceiling. The doorstop skittered across the hardwood floor, spinning to a stop at my feet. My heart lurched painfully in my chest. Power surge, I told myself. Change in air pressure. Rational explanations existed. I gathered my papers with trembling hands and walked to the door, already rehearsing the joke I'd tell on Monday about the building's dramatic farewell. The handle wouldn't turn. I tried again, applying more pressure, thinking it was just stuck as usual. The mechanism moved slightly but wouldn't complete its rotation. Something was preventing it from the other side, which was impossible. The door had no lock, no deadbolt, nothing that could be engaged from the hallway. "Hello?" I called out, my voice embarrassingly thin. "Is someone there?" The door's stuck. No response, but the temperature dropped another few degrees. I pressed my ear against the wood, listening. At first, nothing. Then, soft, deliberate breathing. Not the sound of someone who had just run up the stairs. Not the sound of someone about to announce their presence. The measured, patient breathing of someone listening back. My body reacted before my mind could catch up. I stumbled backward, heart pounding, sweat beading on my forehead despite the cold. The rational part of my brain scrambled for explanations. Another volunteer I hadn't seen leave. A homeless person who had wandered in. The security company doing an early check. "I'm just finishing up some cataloging," I called out, forcing confidence into my voice. "Could you open the door, please?" The fluorescent lights overhead flickered once, twice, then stabilized. The breathing on the other side of the door stopped. Then came the scratching. Light at first, exploratory, fingernails tracing the wood grain of the door. Then harder, more deliberate, moving in strange patterns. Not the sound of someone trying to get in, but something else, something communicative. The scratching traced what felt like symbols. Letters, perhaps, though in no alphabet I recognized. My mouth went desert dry. The temperature had dropped so low that I could see frost forming at the edges of the windows. Impossible for an October evening. A high-pitched ringing started in my ears, and the edges of my vision darkened. I forced myself to take deep breaths. Panic would solve nothing. I backed away from the door, knocking over a chair in my haste, and pulled out my phone. No service. Also strange, as I'd been texting earlier without issue. The overhead lights flickered again, longer this time, and I fumbled in my pocket for the small flashlight I carried. When the lights came back on, the papers on the center table had rearranged themselves. No longer in the neat stacks I'd organized, they now formed concentric circles, with one document placed precisely in the center. My legs nearly gave out. I gripped the edge of a shelf to steady myself, the wooden edge cutting into my palm. The pain anchored me to reality as I stared at the papers, trying to convince myself that a draft had somehow created this deliberate pattern. The scratching at the door grew more insistent. I approached the table on wooden legs, drawn to the center document like a moth to flame. It was a personnel record from 1953, yellowed with age but still legible. The photograph showed a thin-faced man with hollow eyes and a severe expression. Harold Winters, head archivist, 1937-1954. Cause of termination, medical leave, psychiatric. The attached note, written in faded blue ink, simply stated, encountered in archives after hours, claims something was attempting communication through historical records, refused to leave room, required restraints during removal. My hands shook so badly I dropped the paper. As it fluttered to the floor, the scratching at the door stopped abruptly. Then came a sound that still haunts my dreams. Knuckles rapping against the wood. 3 precise knocks. A pause. 3 more knocks. A code. A question. A demand for acknowledgement. Fight or flight took over. I ran to the windows, thinking to escape that way, but they wouldn't budge, painted shut decades ago. The knocking continued, now in varied patterns, almost musical in its precision. I grabbed a heavy brass paperweight from the table and returned to the door. With strength born of terror, I slammed it against the handle repeatedly until something cracked. Whether it was the mechanism or the frame, I didn't care. I hit it again and again, each impact jolting up my arm, sweat pouring down my face despite the freezing air. The door finally gave way with a splintering crack. I nearly fell into the hallway, catching myself against the opposite wall. The corridor stretched empty in both directions, dimly lit by security lights. No sign of anyone who could have been scratching or knocking. But the air felt disturbed somehow, as if someone had just moved through it seconds before. And though I hate to admit it even now, I caught a glimpse of something from the corner of my eye. A tall, thin shape turning the corner at the end of the hall. When I looked directly, nothing was there. I didn't bother closing up properly. I ran down the stairs and out into the parking lot, gulping the warm evening air like a drowning man reaching the surface. My car started on the 3rd try, my hands shaking so badly I could barely insert the key. I called Paolo from the road, mumbling some excuse about a family emergency. I couldn't bring myself to tell him what had happened. Not then, when the experience seemed to dissolve in the harsh light of the street lamps, taking on the quality of a particularly vivid nightmare. But rumors spread quickly among the restoration volunteers. Someone noticed the broken door handle. Someone else mentioned the strange arrangement of papers I'd left behind. Mrs. Abernathy finally shared what she knew about Harold Winters, how he'd been found one morning talking to empty air in the archives, insisting that the building's history was trying to communicate with him through the documents. No one would work in the archive after that. Paolo reassigned me to exterior paint detail, never questioning my obvious relief. Sometimes I catch him looking at me strangely, especially when conversations turn to the 2nd floor. Occasionally, I overhear the other volunteers discussing strange sounds coming from the archive, footsteps when no one is there, the sound of papers rustling, objects falling from shelves. They joke nervously about the Harrington ghost, but they don't know about the scratching. 3 weeks have passed and I haven't returned to the building. But 2 nights ago, I woke at 3:17 a.m. to the sound of fingernails lightly tracing patterns on my bedroom door. When I finally gathered the courage to look, the hallway was empty. Last night, there were 3 precise knocks on my front door just after midnight. When I checked the peephole, the corridor was vacant, but a single yellowed page lay on my welcome mat. I recognized it immediately as one of the property dispute documents I'd been studying that day in the archive. At the bottom of the page, in faded blue ink that hadn't been there before, was a simple message. I'm still cataloging. Join me. Tonight, I'll change the locks. I'll line my doors and windows with salt, an old superstition my grandmother taught me. I'll leave lights on and play music to drown out any sounds from the hallway. But part of me knows these precautions are futile. Whatever found me in that archive room isn't confined by physical barriers. It traced its way into my life through historical documents and property records, through the thin boundary between past and present. And sometimes, in my most honest moments, I wonder if I actually want it to stop. Because beneath my terror lies a terrible curiosity. a need to understand what Harold Winters discovered in those archives. What was trying to communicate then, and what continues to reach out now. The scratching is getting louder. Tonight, I might answer, the fluorescent lights above me flickered in rapid succession, casting momentary shadows across the silent machinery. It's the kind of industrial silence that isn't really silent at all. A persistent hum of dormant equipment, the occasional ping of cooling metal, the building itself seeming to inhale and exhale as the temperature shifts. But at 3 a.m. in a factory built to house hundreds, now operated by dozens, true silence hangs between these mechanical whispers like a shroud. That's when you notice the other sounds, the ones that shouldn't be there. My name is Daniel Mercer. I've worked at Stedman Manufacturing for 11 years, outlasting most of my colleagues through 3 rounds of layoffs. What was once a bustling operation with 3 shifts has dwindled to a skeleton crew, with machines doing most of the work that used to require human hands. I should be grateful. I still have a job. But gratitude is hard to come by during these solitary night shifts. Tonight marked my 4th overnight in 2 weeks. Management called it supervision, but that was just corporate speak for making sure the automated systems didn't malfunction while they saved on labor costs. My actual responsibilities involved checking gauges, recording data, and making sure nothing caught fire. 8 hours of mind-numbing boredom punctuated by moments of inexplicable dread. The east wing of the factory stretched before me, a football field of industrial equipment bathed in the sickly glow of emergency lighting. My footsteps echoed against concrete floors as I made my rounds, clipboard in hand. The metal presses stood like sleeping giants, their massive forms throwing elongated shadows across the floor. I moved methodically, checking each machine, marking my checklist, trying to ignore how the vastness of the space seemed to press in around me rather than extend outward. The first time I heard it, I dismissed it entirely. A subtle scraping sound, like rubber-soled shoes on concrete. In a building this size, sounds travel strangely, bouncing off metal and concrete at odd angles. It was probably just the night janitor, Eduardo, though he usually didn't come until closer to dawn. I continued my rounds, moving toward the hydraulic section. The sound came again, more distinct this time. Footsteps, not the shuffling gait of Eduardo, who was in his 60s with a bad knee but purposeful strides. My pulse quickened slightly, but I rationalized it away. Maybe it was my supervisor making an unexpected check-in, or another worker called in for emergency maintenance. I called out, my voice sounding thin and reedy in the cavernous space. No response came, just the distant hum of machinery and that footstep sound, now moving away from me, toward the western corridor. A prickle of unease crawled up my spine as I followed the sound. The western wing housed older equipment, much of it no longer in use. The corridor narrowed as I walked, the ceiling lower here, the lighting sparse and yellowed with age. My breathing sounded unnaturally loud in my own ears. The footsteps stopped. So did I. The silence that followed felt charged, expectant. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the persistent chill of the building. I forced myself forward, checking each room methodically. The break room, empty. The storage closet, nothing but cleaning supplies and spare parts. The old filing room, dusty cabinets and forgotten paperwork. No one was there, not in any room along the corridor. It was as I turned to head back that I noticed it. A door I'd never really paid attention to before. Heavy steel, industrial grade, with no handle on this side. Just a small keycard reader that had long gone dark. Something about it felt wrong. The factory blueprints I'd studied during safety training never showed what was beyond it. According to management, this section had been decommissioned years ago, before my time. As I stood there staring at the featureless door, a cold draft washed over me. Impossible. The HVAC system in this section had been shut down for years. Yet I could feel it against my skin, carrying with it the faint scent of machine oil and something else. Something organic and unpleasant. Then I heard it. A soft scraping sound from the other side of the door, like fingernails dragging slowly across metal. My heart hammered against my ribs as I pressed my ear to the cold surface. The scraping stopped, replaced by what sounded like breathing, heavy and irregular. I jerked away from the door, nearly stumbling in my haste. The rational part of my brain insisted there must be an explanation. Perhaps some equipment had been left running in the abandoned section, or maybe an animal had somehow found its way in. Yet another part of me, a more primitive part, screamed that whatever waited on the other side of that door was neither mechanical nor animal. I returned to the main floor with a speed that I'd later be embarrassed by. My clipboard clutched so tightly my knuckles had turned white. The rest of my shift passed in hypervigilance, every distant sound magnified by my frayed nerves. When morning finally came, I mentioned the strange door to my replacement, a veteran machinist named Torres. He gave me an odd look, saying only that the western wing was off limits for a reason. Structural issues, asbestos, the usual hazards of an aging industrial building. His dismissive tone made me drop the subject, though his eyes lingered on me a moment too long. That should have been the end of it. A strange experience during a lonely night shift, easily explained away by fatigue and an overactive imagination. But when I returned home to my empty apartment, I couldn't shake the memory of that breathing sound, so distinctly human yet somehow wrong. I tried researching the factory's history online. Stedman Manufacturing had been founded in 1967, producing machine parts for agricultural equipment. There were the usual stories of industrial accidents over the decades, nothing out of the ordinary for a facility of its size and age, nothing that would explain what I'd experienced. Sleep came fitfully that day, my dreams filled with endless corridors and doors that led nowhere. I woke up sweating despite the cool air from my window fan, the distinct feeling of being watched lingering even as I showered and prepared for another night shift. The factory seemed different when I returned that evening. The same machinery, the same hollow spaces, yet somehow altered, as if the entire building had shifted slightly while I was gone. I found myself avoiding the western corridor during my rounds, taking the long way around to check the equipment there. My supervisor noticed my distraction during our brief overlap, asking if I was feeling all right. I blamed it on a poor day's sleep, not mentioning the door or the sounds I'd heard. Something told me that sharing those concerns would only lead to questions about my fitness for the job. 3 uneventful nights passed. The strange door and its mysterious sounds began to feel like a strange dream, a momentary lapse in perception brought on by the isolation of night work. I started to believe my own rationalizations, until the 4th night. I was checking the metal presses when the lights flickered. Not the usual fluorescent stutter, but a prolonged dimming that left the factory floor in near darkness for several seconds. When they returned to full brightness, the silence that followed was absolute. The background hum of the building had ceased, as if the entire electrical system had momentarily held its breath. Then came the footsteps again, more insistent this time, not trying to be subtle, not moving away but coming closer. My mouth went dry, my throat constricting as I turned toward the sound. The beam of my flashlight cut through the shadows of the factory floor, illuminating nothing but machinery. Yet the footsteps continued, steady and deliberate, moving from the western corridor toward my position. I backed away, my pulse pounding in my ears. My back hit the cool metal of a press machine, startling a gasp from my lips that sounded obscenely loud in the quiet space. The footsteps stopped. For 30 seconds, maybe a minute, I stood frozen, straining to hear over the thunder of my own heartbeat. Then, slowly, I edged along the machine, making my way toward the supervisor's office where there was a phone, other people I could call. I never made it there. The lights flickered again, and in that moment of darkness, I felt, rather than heard, something move past me. A displacement of air, the subtle shift in temperature that comes from a body in motion. When the light stabilized, I was alone, but the door to the western corridor stood open. It took everything I had not to run. Instead, I moved carefully toward the office, my keys gripped between my fingers as a makeshift weapon. I tried calling my supervisor, then the night security guard who was supposed to patrol the perimeter. Neither answered. I told myself I would just wait in the office until morning. That's what any sane person would do. But as I sat there, Watching the minutes tick by with excruciating slowness, a new sound emerged from the silence. A distant metallic tapping, rhythmic and persistent. It was coming from the western wing. Something inside me needed to know. Some deeply flawed part of my psyche couldn't bear the mystery, the not knowing. I told myself I was just going to take a quick look, confirm it was nothing but loose pipes or cooling metal, then return to the safety of the office. The western corridor was darker than I remembered, my flashlight beam seeming to penetrate only a few feet before being swallowed by the gloom. The tapping grew louder as I approached that same featureless door, now standing slightly ajar, a thin line of darkness visible between door and frame. My hands trembled as I directed the light toward the gap. The beam illuminated nothing but more darkness beyond. The logical part of my brain screamed at me to turn back, to call the police, to do anything but what I was about to do. I pushed the door open wider. The air that rushed out was stale and cold, carrying that same unpleasant organic smell I'd noticed before, stronger now. My flashlight revealed a narrow service corridor extending into darkness, its walls lined with pipes and electrical conduits. The floor was covered in a fine layer of dust, undisturbed save for a single set of footprints leading away from the door. They weren't human footprints. The shape was wrong, too elongated. The toe area splayed in a way that human feet simply don't move. They seemed to have been made by something that only approximated human locomotion, as if it had studied the concept, but couldn't quite replicate it. My breath caught in my throat, coming in short, shallow gasps as I stared at those impossible prints. The tapping had stopped the moment I opened the door, replaced by that breathing sound again. Closer now, just around a bend in the corridor ahead. I should have closed the door. I should have run. Instead, I found myself moving forward, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't explain even to myself. The flashlight beam bounced erratically as my shaking hand struggled to keep it steady. Sweat rolled down my back despite the chill, my shirt sticking uncomfortably to my skin. The corridor turned sharply to the right, opening into what appeared to be an old control room. Banks of outdated equipment lined the walls, their displays long dark. In the center stood a single chair facing away from me. It was occupied. I could see only the back of a head, hair sparse and colorless. A thin hand rested on the chair's arm, fingers unnaturally long and jointed, tapping against the metal in that same rhythm I'd heard before. The tapping stopped. The head began to turn. I ran. I ran as I've never run before, my lungs burning, legs pumping as I sprinted back through the corridor, past the door, down the western wing. I didn't stop until I reached the main floor, collapsing against a support column, gasping for breath, my heart threatening to burst from my chest. When I finally gathered the courage to look back, the door to the abandoned section was closed. No sign remained of what I'd seen, what I'd experienced. By the time my replacement arrived, I had almost convinced myself it had been a hallucination brought on by stress and isolation. Almost. I requested a transfer to day shift the next morning. My supervisor seemed unsurprised, mentioning that night shifts in the factory had always had high turnover. When I pressed him about the abandoned western section, his expression closed off, becoming carefully neutral as he explained that the area had structural damage from a small fire years ago and was slated for demolition once the company secured the proper permits. I didn't believe him, but I nodded anyway. What else could I do? Tell him about impossibly shaped footprints and things that weren't quite human sitting in abandoned control rooms. I'd be sent for a psychological evaluation, not a shift change. They granted my transfer, but it came with reduced hours, a trade-off I gladly accepted. During my final night shifts while waiting for the paperwork to process, I stayed as far from the western corridor as possible, keeping to well-lit areas with multiple exit routes. The footsteps returned each night, sometimes distant, sometimes alarmingly close. Once, I swear I heard my name whispered from just behind me, the sound somehow coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. I never saw the door open again, never glimpsed what waited in that abandoned wing. My last night shift was 3 weeks ago. I work days now, surrounded by other people, the factory floor bustling with activity and human voices. The door to the western wing remains closed during daylight hours, its existence barely noticed by workers who have no reason to venture that way. But sometimes, when I'm working late and the factory begins to empty, I catch glimpses of my night supervisor leading new hires toward that corridor for what he calls specialized training. Their faces are always eager, untroubled. They never seem to return to day shift. And sometimes, in the parking lot after my shift, I look up at the windows of the factory's western wing, windows that should open into empty, abandoned spaces, and see lights moving within, silhouettes pacing back and forth in rooms that officially don't exist anymore. I've started looking for another job. Until then, I avoid overtime. I never stay past sunset. And I try not to notice how certain coworkers sometimes stare at me for too long, their eyes reflecting the fluorescent lights in ways that human eyes shouldn't. And I try very hard not to think about what's really behind that door, or why the company keeps it there, or what happens during those night shifts when the factory stands nearly empty, and that thing in the abandoned control room sits waiting, tapping its two long fingers, listening for footsteps approaching its domain. The ocean doesn't care if you're listening. It speaks anyway, in rhythms older than language. But sometimes, rarely, it speaks directly to you. And when it does, you better pay attention. I'd rented the weathered cedar beach house in mid-October, well after the summer crowds had vanished, and the coastal town of Seacliff had settled into its off-season hibernation. My divorce had been finalized 3 weeks earlier, and after months of legal wrangling and emotional exhaustion, I craved isolation like a drowning man craves air. The listing promised secluded beachfront solitude, and the price had dropped to nearly nothing with the season's end. Perfect. The rental agent handed me the keys with a thin smile that didn't reach her eyes. She mentioned something about the place being vacant for a while, and that I shouldn't mind the usual coastal noises. When I asked what she meant, she shrugged and said, "The winter tide brings things in that summer tide doesn't." Before I could press further, she was already walking to her car, phone pressed to her ear. The house sat on stilts atop a small dune, facing the gray expanse of the Atlantic. A wooden deck wrapped around 3 sides, and weathered steps led down to the beach. To the north, I could see 3 or 4 similar structures dotting the coastline, all dark and shuttered for the season. To the south stood a larger Victorian-style beach house about 100 yards away. Its peeling paint and boarded windows told me it had been abandoned long ago. That first afternoon, I settled in quickly. I unpacked my books, stocked the refrigerator with enough food for a week, and poured myself a generous whiskey while watching the sun sink into the ocean. The quiet was magnificent. No traffic noise, no neighbors, no notification pings. Just the steady rhythm of waves and the occasional cry of a gull. My shoulders relaxed for the first time in months. As darkness fell, I decided to take a walk along the shore. The night air had a bite to it, carrying the scent of salt and decay. A half moon provided just enough light to see my way as I trudged through the soft sand, letting the frigid water occasionally lap at my boots. The emptiness of the beach stretched in both directions, making me feel wonderfully insignificant. I'd walked about 10 minutes when something caught my eye, a faint golden light glowing from the direction of the abandoned Victorian house. It flickered from what appeared to be the second-story veranda, a warm pinprick against the darkness. I stopped, squinting through the night. The house had looked thoroughly vacant earlier. The windows were boarded, and the listing agent had mentioned nothing about neighbors. A cloud passed over the moon, and when my vision readjusted, the light was gone. I stood motionless, staring at the dark silhouette of the house. Had I imagined it? The whiskey, perhaps, or a reflection from somewhere else? I waited several minutes, but the darkness remained unbroken. Feeling a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the temperature, I turned back toward my rental. The wind had picked up, driving stinging particles of sand against my face. My footprints from earlier had already been erased by the encroaching tide, leaving the beach a blank slate behind me. As I climbed the wooden steps to my deck, my flashlight beam caught something unusual, a series of wet footprints crossing the weathered boards. They appeared to circle the perimeter of the house before disappearing at the back door. My pulse quickened. The footprints were fresh, water still pooling in their depressions. Someone had been here while I was walking. Someone with bare feet, coming straight from the ocean. I called out, my voice sounding thin against the wind. No response came except the continuing rhythm of the waves. I checked the locks on all doors and windows. Secure. Nothing appeared disturbed inside. After a careful search of the house with a kitchen knife in hand, I convinced myself it must have been a trespasser who realized the place was occupied and left. Still, sleep came fitfully that night. The house creaked and settled with the changing temperature, and the wind found every gap in the old structure, creating moans and whistles that sounded disturbingly like distant human voices. I dreamed of dark water and things rising from the depths. Morning brought clear skies and rational thought. The footprints had dried completely, leaving only faint salt residue that could have been there for days. I told myself I was being ridiculous, probably just leftover marks from the cleaning service or the previous renters. I spent the day reading on the deck, occasionally glancing toward the Victorian house, which looked thoroughly abandoned in the daylight. It was during my second afternoon that I noticed the first shells. 3 small scallop shells placed in a perfect triangle below my bedroom window. I hadn't put them there. They were positioned with a precision that seemed deliberate, each shell equidistant from the others. I picked one up, turning it over in my hand. Its interior had an unusual bluish iridescence I'd never seen before. I swept them away and tried to focus on my book, but found myself repeatedly looking up, scanning the empty beach. That night, I double-checked all locks before going to bed. The third morning, I found more shells. This time, a line of 7 perfect spirals arranged along the windowsill of the kitchen. I hadn't heard anything during the night, and all doors remained locked. My skin prickled as I gathered them and threw them far into the dunes. That afternoon, the weather turned. Dark clouds rolled in from the horizon, and the ocean grew restless. I sat in the living room watching the waves grow larger, crashing against the shore with increasing violence. The wind howled around the eaves of the house, and rain began to lash against the windows. I built a fire in the old stone fireplace and tried to lose myself in my book, but my attention kept drifting to the sounds of the storm. It was just after midnight when I heard it, a soft, persistent whispering coming from somewhere outside my bedroom window. At first, I thought it was just the wind finding new gaps in the house's weathered frame. But as I listened, the sound resolved into something more deliberate, more rhythmic, like human speech, but just below the threshold of comprehension. My heart hammered against my ribs as I slowly approached the window. The whispering continued, rising and falling like the tide itself. I pulled back the curtain just enough to peer out into the storm-tossed night. Nothing. Just rain and darkness. But the whispering didn't stop. If anything, it grew more insistent, more urgent. I moved from window to window, searching for its source. Each time I approached, the sound seemed to shift, always coming from somewhere I wasn't looking. My palms were slick with sweat, and my throat had gone desert dry. Then I saw it, a figure standing at the water's edge, barely visible through the rain-streaked glass. Tall and thin, unnaturally still amid the churning surf. I couldn't make out features, just a dark silhouette against the foaming waves. I blinked, and it was gone. But the whispering continued. Sleep was impossible. I spent the remainder of the night in a chair facing the windows, a heavy flashlight clutched in my white-knuckled grip. When dawn finally broke, I searched the beach, but the storm had erased any evidence that might have been there. The fourth day brought more shells, dozens of them arranged in concentric circles on my deck. And now there was something else. A thick line of seaweed spelling out what looked like words, though in no language I recognized. My hands trembled as I took photos with my phone. The internet connection was too weak to research what I was seeing or even to send the images to friends. That evening, as twilight descended, I noticed the light again in the abandoned Victorian house. This time it was stronger, and I was certain it was coming from inside. Desperation for answers overrode my mounting fear. I grabbed my flashlight and headed down the beach. The old house loomed larger as I approached, its dilapidated grandeur taking on a sinister aspect in the fading light. Up close, I could see that many of the boards over the windows had rotted or come loose. The veranda sagged precariously, and parts of the roof had collapsed entirely. I circled the structure, looking for signs of recent entry. The main door was secured with a rusted chain, but I discovered a cellar entrance around back that stood partially open. My better judgment screamed at me to turn around, but I needed to know who or what was sharing this desolate stretch of beach with me. The cellar smelled of mold and salt water. My flashlight beam revealed debris-strewn floors and water damage on the walls. After finding a staircase, I made my way to the first floor, then the second. Room after empty room greeted me, some with gaping holes in the floor or ceiling. There was no sign of recent occupation, no light source that could have been what I'd seen from the beach. In what must have been the master bedroom, I found a small collection of objects arranged on a water-stained dresser. More of those iridescent shells, a tarnished silver hand mirror, and a book bound in what looked like fish skin. The book's cover bore the same unrecognizable script I'd seen spelled out in seaweed on my deck. My flashlight flickered, then died. In the sudden darkness, I became aware of a presence behind me, a subtle shift in the air, the feeling of being watched. My breath caught in my throat as I slowly turned around. The room was empty, but now I could hear it again. That same whispering, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. The temperature plummeted, and my exhaled breath clouded in front of my face. I stumbled backward, my foot catching on a loose floorboard. As I regained my balance, my elbow struck the mirror on the dresser, sending it crashing to the floor. In the shattered fragments, I caught a glimpse of movement. A pale face with dark, hollow eyes, watching me from what should have been my own reflection. I ran. Down the rotting stairs, through the moldering rooms, out through the cellar door. I didn't stop until I reached my rental house, lungs burning and legs weak with exhaustion and terror. Inside, I found more shells, hundreds of them, covering every surface, and on the living room wall, scratched into the wood with something sharp, the same unrecognizable script, alongside a crude drawing of a human figure being pulled into stylized waves. That was when I noticed the smell, briny and organic, like low tide in high summer. It permeated everything, and underneath it, the unmistakable smell of decay. The whispering started again, louder now, coming from inside the walls themselves. I didn't wait to see what would emerge. I grabbed my keys, phone, and wallet, leaving everything else behind. As I started my car, I glanced back at the house. In the upper window, I saw a figure, tall and gaunt with skin the color of a drowned corpse. It raised a hand, beckoning. I drove through the night, putting as much distance as possible between myself and Seacliff. I've never returned for my belongings, never contacted the rental agency. Sometimes I see the same iridescent shells washed up on beaches hundreds of miles away. Sometimes I wake to the sound of whispering just below the threshold of understanding. And sometimes, when I catch my reflection in still water, I see something else looking back. Something with hollow eyes and skin like a drowned corpse waiting for me to answer the ocean's call, because the tide brings things in, and eventually it takes them back out again. The first thing I noticed were the footprints, fresh, distinct, impossible. They appeared suddenly in the thick layer of dust that had settled over the concrete floor of my workshop during the 3 weeks I'd been away. Tennis shoe treads, size 11 or 12, cutting a deliberate path from the front gate straight toward the back storage area, where I kept my most valuable auto parts. My throat tightened as I tracked them with my flashlight, the beam trembling slightly in my unsteady hand. I'd inherited this auto repair shop from my father 6 months ago after he retired to Florida, and I still wasn't fully comfortable with its quirks. The old building sat on the outskirts of town, flanked by empty lots and the occasional home spaced far enough apart that neighbors weren't really neighbors at all, just distant lights in the growing dusk. The footprints bothered me, not just their presence, but their precision. A single line, no wandering, no hesitation. They moved with purpose toward the restricted storage area where I kept the expensive parts and specialty tools. But what bothered me even more was the side door. It was locked. From the inside, I ran my fingers along the frame, checking for signs of forced entry. Nothing. The old padlock hung intact. The metal door showed no dents or scrapes. Yet somehow, the footprints continued directly to that door, as if whoever, or whatever, had made them had simply passed through solid metal. I took an involuntary step back, my boots scuffing loudly in the silence. The late October air had brought an unseasonable chill, but the cold sweat forming on my back had nothing to do with the temperature. I'd come in early to catch up on paperwork before my regular Tuesday appointments. Now, at 5:30 a.m., the darkness outside seemed to press against the grimy windows of the shop, eager to get in. I pulled out my phone, its screen casting a blue glow over my face. No service, typical for this part of town. The landline was in the office, but suddenly the 20 feet between me and that room felt like a mile. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and gripped my heavy mag light tighter, its weight reassuring in my palm. That's when I heard it. A faint metallic tap, then another, coming from the storage room. My heart slammed against my rib cage. The sound was deliberate, rhythmic. Tap, tap, tap. Then silence. Then again. Tap, tap, tap. I considered my options. The nearest neighbor was Old Man Grayson, nearly a quarter-mile down the road. The police station was 15 minutes away, assuming they'd even respond to what would sound like a paranoid complaint about footprints and mysterious tapping. I cleared my throat, trying to project a confidence I didn't feel. Hello? The shop's closed. If you're in there, you need to leave. Now. My voice echoed in the cavernous space, bouncing off tool cabinets and the hulking shapes of cars waiting for repair. The tapping stopped. The silence that followed was worse. I approached the storage room door slowly, flashlight extended like a weapon. My free hand reached for the ring of keys in my pocket. The storage room key was brass, notched differently than the others. I could identify it by touch, a skill my father had insisted I develop. As I slid the key into the lock, a cold draft whispered past my ankles. Impossible. There were no windows in that room, no vents large enough to create such a distinct current of air. My hand froze on the key. The tapping had resumed, but different now, faster, urgent, like a warning. Against every instinct screaming at me to run, I turned the key and pushed the door open. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating shelves of parts, stacked tires, and boxes of inventory. Nothing seemed disturbed. Nothing moved. The tapping had stopped the moment the door opened. I stepped inside, sweeping the light methodically across every corner. The room was roughly 15 feet square, with metal shelving units reaching to the ceiling and a small workbench against the far wall. No signs of disturbance. No footprints in the dust on this floor. No one hiding among the shelves. I released a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, my shoulders slumping with momentary relief. Then my light caught something on the workbench. A wrench, positioned perfectly in the center of the otherwise empty surface. I approached slowly. It was my father's favorite torquey wrench, an expensive German model he rarely let anyone touch. I hadn't seen it since he left, but here it was, polished to a shine that seemed to capture and reflect my flashlight beam with unnatural intensity. When I reached for it, the wrench was ice cold. Colder than metal should be in an unheated room. Cold enough that my fingertips burned at the contact. I withdrew my hand with a sharp intake of breath. The lights flickered on. I hadn't touched the switch. It was on the opposite wall, a good 10 feet away. Yet the fluorescent tubes overhead hummed to life, bathing the room in harsh white light. I spun around, heart hammering, but I was still alone. The door remained open exactly as I'd left it. My mouth went dry. The logical part of my brain scrambled for explanations. Faulty wiring, a power surge, delayed timer, while primitive instincts sent adrenaline coursing through my veins. That's when I noticed the blueprint on the floor. It hadn't been there seconds ago when I'd scanned the room. The yellowed paper was unfurled neatly, small metal washers placed at each corner to keep it flat. I recognized it immediately, the original blueprint for the building, dating back to 1967 when my grandfather had first constructed it. I crouched down, studying the faded blue lines. Someone had marked the blueprint with red ink, circling an area beneath the main shop floor. But that was impossible. The building didn't have a basement, at least none that I knew of. The circled area corresponded to a spot near the hydraulic lift in the center of the shop. I'd done dozens of oil changes in that exact location. Never once had there been any indication of a space below. The tapping started again, not from inside this room, but from directly under my feet. Urgent now, insistent. Tap, 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 tap. I backed out of the storage room, eyes fixed on the floor as if expecting it to give way beneath me. The sound followed, seeming to track my movement. When I stopped, it stopped. When I took another step, it resumed, always directly beneath me. Cold sweat trickled down my spine. My breath came in short, shallow gasps. I needed to leave, to call someone, anyone, but curiosity and fear warred within me. What was under the floor? Who had left those footprints? How had they gotten through a locked door? I moved to the hydraulic lift, guided by some compulsion I couldn't name. The tapping grew louder, more frantic. I knelt down, running my fingers along the concrete around the base of the lift. It felt different here, newer, perhaps. The color didn't quite match the surrounding floor. Using a flathead screwdriver from my pocket, I probed the seam where the lift met the concrete. To my shock, the tool slipped into a narrow gap, encountering no resistance. I worked it further, and a section of what I'd thought was solid concrete shifted slightly. My pulse pounded in my ears as I worked the screwdriver around what was clearly a disguised trapdoor. It was expertly crafted, nearly invisible unless you knew exactly what to look for. After a minute of careful prying, I managed to lift one edge enough to grip it with my fingers. The tapping stopped the moment I lifted the panel. Below, a narrow set of metal stairs descended into darkness. The air that rushed up was stale, tinged with the scents of old motor oil and something else, something earthy and organic that I couldn't identify. I shined my flashlight down, but the beam couldn't penetrate more than a few feet into the gloom. It was as if the darkness itself was swallowing the light. Every rational thought told me to replace the panel, walk out of the shop, and never return, or at least to call the police. But my father had never mentioned a basement. Neither had my grandfather in all his stories about building this place. Whatever was down there was a secret they had kept, even from family. I took one cautious step down, then another. The metal stairs creaked beneath my weight. The temperature dropped noticeably with each step until my breath fogged in front of my face. 7 steps down, I paused, listening. Silence. Absolute silence. Not even the familiar sounds of the building settling or distant traffic penetrated this space. At the bottom of the stairs, my flashlight revealed a small room, perhaps 10 feet square, with walls of poured concrete. It was empty except for a metal filing cabinet in one corner and what appeared to be an old workbench along the far wall. I approached the cabinet, each footstep echoing. The drawers were unlocked. The top one contained folders labeled with dates spanning the 1970s. I pulled one out randomly, flipping it open to find newspaper clippings about local disappearances. Men mostly, between the ages of 20 and 40. In the margins were handwritten notes in what I recognized as my grandfather's cramped script. My stomach clenched. I moved to the second drawer. More folders, more clippings, these from the 1980s and 90s. The third drawer held similar contents from the 2000s, with the most recent article dated just 2 years ago. I slammed the drawer shut, mind reeling. What was this place? What had my grandfather, and possibly my father, been involved in? The workbench drew my attention next. Upon closer inspection, it wasn't a bench at all, but a long metal table with restraints attached at intervals. Dark stains marked its surface. I took an involuntary step back, bile rising in my throat. That's when the lights in the basement flickered on, just as they had in the storage room above. And in the sudden brightness, I saw what my flashlight had failed to illuminate. The walls were covered in photographs, hundreds of them, arranged in a meticulous grid. Men I didn't recognize, all photographed without their knowledge, going about their daily lives, entering their homes, working at various jobs. And in the center of this disturbing mosaic was a photo of me, taken just last week as I collected mail from my apartment building. I recognized the shirt I was wearing, remembered that exact moment. Someone had been watching me. Someone had been in my father's secret room. The tapping resumed, but now I could pinpoint its source. The metal table. A wrench, identical to the one I'd seen upstairs, was moving on its own, handle striking the surface in that same deliberate rhythm. Tap, 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 tap. My legs nearly gave out. I stumbled backward toward the stairs, unable to tear my gaze from the wrench as it continued its impossible movement. My back hit something solid, something that shouldn't have been there. The stairs had been directly behind me. I turned slowly, a scream building in my throat, but unable to escape. A man stood blocking my path to the stairs. He wore coveralls identical to those my father always wore, right down to the embroidered name patch. But the coveralls hung on a frame too thin to be human, the fabric draping over angles that no human skeleton could form. Where a face should have been was only shadow, deeper and more absolute than merely the absence of light. The figure extended what approximated a hand. In it was a set of keys, my father's keys, which he'd supposedly taken with him to Florida. I understood then. The footprints leading to a locked door, the secret room. My father's abrupt decision to retire after a lifetime of declaring he'd die in his beloved shop. Whatever stood before me wasn't my father. Perhaps it never had been. I dove to the side, pure survival instinct driving me. Somehow I made it past the figure, scrambling up the metal stairs on all fours. I didn't look back, didn't slow down as I burst through the trapdoor and sprinted across the workshop floor, past the mysterious footprints that now made terrible sense. I grabbed my bag near the entrance, not stopping to lock up. The morning sun was just beginning to lighten the sky as I threw myself into my truck and jammed the key into the ignition. As the engine roared to life, I caught a glimpse of movement at the shop door. A figure in familiar coveralls stood watching me, its featureless face tilted slightly as if in curiosity. In one hand it held the wrench, in the other, the keys to a legacy I now understood I could never escape. I slammed the truck into reverse, tires squealing as I backed onto the empty road. As I shifted into drive and pressed the accelerator to the floor, my phone buzzed with an incoming text. At the next intersection, I glanced at the screen. It was from my father's number. The message contained only an address, my apartment building, and 3 words that turned my blood to ice. I'm coming home. As I drove away from the shop, a cold certainty settled in my bones. I couldn't go home. I couldn't go to the police. How do you explain that the man who raised you might never have been a man at all? That the business passed down through 3 generations might be covering something unfathomable? The sun climbed higher, bringing light, but no warmth. In my rearview mirror, the shop receded, looking so normal, so innocent in the morning light. But I knew what waited inside. And I knew, with sickening clarity, that it wasn't finished with me yet. I could still hear the tapping in my mind. Regular, insistent, like a heartbeat that refused to die.